Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. My name is Charles, and I'm the caretaker of an animal sanctuary for abandoned pets on the outskirts of Austin, Texas. The sanctuary isn't large, but it's full of life. Dogs and cats that have been left to their fate, some with stories of abuse, others simply forgotten by their owners. I came to this place by pure chance. I needed a job, and the only thing I could find was this small sanctuary that at the time barely had resources to survive. What began as a way to make a living became a passion. The sanctuary, though difficult in its early days, became my home. I cared for it as if it were my own family, doing everything possible to ensure the animals had everything they needed. Every day I fed them, took them for walks, and made sure they were as comfortable as possible. The animals responded well to me. Some, though shy at first, gradually got used to my presence. Others, older and wiser, looked at me with a kind of understanding, as if they knew I was there to give them a safe place. But something began to change one autumn afternoon, when the sun barely touched the horizon. It was a quiet afternoon, one of those days when the wind blows gently and light filters through the tree branches, giving the place a peculiar calm. I was cleaning the dog area when I noticed that one of them, an old German shepherd named Max, began behaving strangely. Normally, Max was one of the calmest. He always stayed by his bed, watching the world without hurry. But that afternoon, he began moving from side to side, looking toward the walls with an intensity that wasn't usual for him. I approached him thinking that maybe something had scared him, but I didn't see anything that could have disturbed him. I called him by name, but he didn't pay attention to me. In fact, he seemed more concerned about something in the shadows. I crouched next to him and petted his head, trying to calm him, but something in his behavior made me feel uncomfortable. Something wasn't right. That night after dinner, and while I was preparing to sleep in my small room at the back of the sanctuary, I heard something, a soft noise, like the brush of something heavy moving across the floor. At first I thought it was one of the animals, maybe a cat or dog that had gotten out of its cage. But when I checked the area, everything was in its place. The animals slept peacefully, and there was no trace of movement in the facilities. I didn't give it much importance at the moment. However, the next day the atmosphere remained strange. The air was dense, and something told me that not everything was as calm as it seemed. Max continued to be restless, but it wasn't just him anymore. All the dogs, even the calmest ones, seemed to alter their behavior. Some barked for no reason, others stared toward the back corner, where there was a small storage room we used to keep food and supplies. I didn't like the feeling, so I decided to check. What I found was strange. The storage room door was ajar, something I hadn't noticed before. I made sure I had closed it the night before because I always check it before sleeping. I approached slowly, wondering if perhaps someone could have entered, but I saw nothing. Everything was in its place. Despite this, the feeling that something was stalking me didn't disappear. Over the following days, the strange behaviors became more frequent. Every night, around 3 in the morning, I heard noises. Soft sounds like footsteps in the hallway or the creaking of the old wood in the sanctuary. I thought about the possibility that it was some animal that escaped, but I didn't see tracks or marks that could confirm that theory. Besides, the dogs reacted the same way. They barked, growled, became alert, as if someone or something was watching them from the shadows. One night, I decided to stay awake. I hid in the small office I had at the back, with a view toward the main hallway, hoping that at least I could discover what was happening. The silence of the night was so thick you could hear the murmur of my breathing and the occasional sigh of one of the dogs. Then, around 2:30 in the morning, I heard it, a weak creak, as if something was walking on the wooden floor of the hallway. It wasn't the sound of an animal paw, but something heavier, as if someone was walking cautiously. My heart began to beat faster, and although I tried to calm myself, I couldn't avoid feeling a growing sensation of fear. I decided to go out and verify, armed with a flashlight and a couple of sticks I used to keep the dogs calm when they were restless. I walked through the hallway in total silence, trying not to make noise. When I reached the corner that led to the storage room, the flashlight briefly illuminated something on the floor. They were footprints, but not from animals. They were human footprints, large and heavy, as if someone had been walking there, leaving marks in the dust. My mind tried to rationalize it, but the sensation of terror enveloped me more and more. How could someone be entering the sanctuary without me noticing? I knew I wasn't crazy. I couldn't be. The dogs, normally so calm at those hours, were on the verge of hysteria. Some of them growled toward the back of the sanctuary, toward the storage room. Others even moved away from the corners where they used to rest, looking toward the shadows with the hair on their backs standing up. I decided to return to the storage room the next day, more out of necessity to know what was happening than anything else. Something told me I should investigate further. When I arrived, I checked the floor and walls, and it was then that I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Marks on the walls, as if something had scratched or clawed them. They were deep, as if something with large, sharp claws had passed through there. Terror began to take hold of me. Something was lurking in the sanctuary, something that wasn't normal. During the following night, I armed myself with courage and decided to stay awake again. This time, however, I sat near the dogs, observing their reactions, hoping to see something more that would indicate that someone or something was moving in the shadows. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it again. The sound of soft footsteps, this time closer, as if they were right behind me. I got up quickly, but when I turned, I saw no one. The dogs began barking frantically, a sign that something was there, something I couldn't see, but they could. I decided to go out and take a look around the entire sanctuary, but I found nothing. However, in the distance, near the storage room, I saw a figure in the darkness, a shadow that vanished the instant my flashlight illuminated it. That was the last time I was calm in the sanctuary. I left everything the next day after talking to the police and some neighbors, but no one could give me a reasonable explanation. The animals were no longer restless, although the dogs continued looking toward the back of the sanctuary, as if waiting for something or someone to return. I never knew who or what was lurking among the walls of the sanctuary, but one thing is certain. Since that day, every time I think about that place, I feel that something or someone still walks among the shadows of the storage room. And if I ever approached that place, I know that the feeling of being watched would never disappear. After abandoning the sanctuary, I stayed a few days at my brother's house. I needed to calm down, process everything I had experienced. although the truth is neither he nor anyone in the family understood what had really happened. They thought it had been a combination of stress, work, the loneliness of recent months. But I knew that what I experienced in that place had no rational explanation. A few days later, the police contacted me. They showed some interest in the footprints I had found, but after a couple of reviews at the sanctuary, they gave up. They said that maybe some vandal had snuck in during the night, but they found no evidence of forced entry, no tracks indicating that someone had passed more than once. Of course, the sanctuary was empty. When I mentioned the strange reactions of the dogs and the marks on the walls, they just gave me doubtful looks. In the end, they took no significant action. I was trapped between what I had experienced and the need to leave it behind. I felt guilty for having abandoned the sanctuary, as if I had failed the animals, but I also knew I couldn't return there. The fear was too great, and every time I thought about that place, an indescribable feeling of vulnerability invaded me. I didn't know if what I had felt was real, but the terror of being so alone, of not knowing what was lurking in the dark corners, terrified me. Despite everything, I couldn't help but return to the area. Something pushed me to do it, a dark curiosity that kept me awake at night. I wanted answers. I wanted to find something that would help me understand what had really happened. Maybe it was the need to find a logical explanation that led me, or maybe just the desire to close that chapter. I didn't know. So one afternoon I decided to return to the sanctuary. After all, the animals were still there, and maybe if I returned, I could fix everything somehow. I returned with the intention of spending only a few hours, bringing them some food, maybe giving the dogs and cats a little affection. But when I arrived, the place seemed different to me, as if something had changed in those few days I was away. The first impression I had when getting out of the truck was the silence. Not the normal silence of the countryside, the usual one, but an oppressive silence, as if the atmosphere was charged. The dogs didn't bark as they used to when I arrived, nor was there the typical noise of cats running around in the play areas. Everything was in deep silence. I felt a knot in my stomach. It was as if everything was waiting. I walked toward the main entrance and noticed that the door was slightly open, something that never happened. I always made sure to close it properly. I stopped before entering, thinking that maybe someone had entered to clean or do some kind of maintenance, but I saw no one. The place was messy, as if it hadn't been touched in weeks. At first, I didn't want to think the worst. I thought someone had simply left everything messy, maybe some volunteer or even a thief. But when I entered and turned on the light, everything changed. The dogs were in their cages, quiet, staring at me fixedly. None of them reacted to my presence. They were completely motionless, as if they were waiting for something. I felt pressure in my chest. Something wasn't right. I approached the dog cages, one by one, to see if they were okay. Max, the German shepherd who had always been so loyal, was lying on his bed, but he didn't move when I approached. He also showed no signs of having eaten or drunk. I thought maybe he was sick, but something in his gaze disturbed me. His face was pale, his eyes opaque, as if life had escaped him. It was as if he was trapped in a deep sleep, or worse yet, in something more sinister. Suddenly I heard a sound in the distance, something coming from the back of the storage room. It was the same creaking I had heard weeks ago, but this time it was stronger, clearer. I didn't dare move, but I also couldn't avoid following the sound. I walked toward the storage room with my heart beating hard. The door was ajar, and although I was afraid, I couldn't resist the need to see what was there. Upon entering, the temperature dropped suddenly, as if the air had become denser. The flashlight I carried began to flicker, as if something was interfering with the light. When I finally managed to turn it on completely, I saw something that chilled my blood. There were footprints on the floor, but they weren't from an animal. They were human footprints, large, deep, as if someone had walked there with heavy shoes. And not only that, I saw something else on the walls. Deep marks, almost like scars that ran along the wood, as if something with claws had passed through there. I felt an oppression in my chest, a visceral fear that wouldn't let me breathe. My body wanted to move, to run away, but I couldn't. Something kept me there, looking at the footprints and marks. Who had been here? What was happening? The place, though empty, seemed to be charged with a disturbing presence, as if something was waiting. And then I heard a voice, a soft voice, almost a whisper, coming from somewhere inside the storage room. I couldn't understand what it said, but the voice was clearly there. I turned toward the entrance, but I saw no one. However, fear had already paralyzed me. The air was stale, as if it had been trapped in the walls, and the smell of mold and humidity mixed with a sensation of decomposition. I left the storage room immediately, and when I looked around, I noticed that the dogs were no longer silent. They barked furiously, as if they were responding to something, but not to me. They seemed alert, as if they perceived something more than my presence. I felt watched, as if I wasn't alone. I turned on my heels with the feeling that something was following me, something I couldn't see, but that was very close. At that moment, I made the decision to leave. It didn't matter if the dogs needed food or if the facilities were in bad condition. I couldn't stay there another minute. I ran to the truck, got in without looking back, and started it as fast as I could. That night I didn't sleep. The image of the human footprints and the whispering voice haunted me. What was lurking in that place? Something inside me knew I would never get an answer. And although I looked for a logical explanation, something told me there were things that simply cannot be understood. The sanctuary was no longer the same, and I was no longer the same after being there. I never returned to the sanctuary again. Despite the fact that the animals are still there, under the care of other people, my connection to that place was completely broken. No one else has reported anything strange, but I know that what I experienced wasn't just my imagination. There's something else in those walls, something that lurks in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to come to light. And although I try to forget, every time I pass near the sanctuary, I feel that same pressure in my chest, that whisper in the air. And I know that the footprints are still there, waiting to be found by someone else. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. Good evening. Everything all right? I decided to write because what happened to me in the last few months still doesn't make sense. And I feel that if I don't tell someone, I'll end up going completely insane. My name is Robert, and my story begins with a family promise. I'm an architect. I spend my days in the hustle and bustle of the big city between projects, clients, and the constant noise that you eventually get used to. but part of my family still lives in the countryside, in one of those places where the asphalt seems to give up and surrender to dirt roads. It was there that I returned in April, after almost 10 years without visiting. The mission was simple, at least on paper. Restore the family chapel, a small, old construction that sits in the back of the property that belonged to my great-grandmother and is now cared for by my great-uncle, Benjamin. The idea came from my parents as a way to preserve the memory of those who came before. For me, it was a good excuse to get out of the routine and, honestly, an interesting professional challenge. I imagined the before and after, the pride of delivering it finished. I arrived on a Friday afternoon. The hot air, the smell of grass, the silence that buzzes in your ears, it's a different rhythm. My Uncle Benjamin received me on the porch with that contained smile of someone who's not much for hugging. He's a man of few words, aged by the sun and work. While we drank some sweet tea, I explained my plan, showed him the preliminary drawings I had made. "Don't worry, Uncle. In about 2 months we'll have her good as new," I said, full of confidence, pointing with my chin toward the construction visible in the distance. He just nodded slowly, looking at the same spot. "Yeah, I hope so, son, I hope so." His pause was a bit too long. That chapel has a lot of history. At the time, I didn't pay much attention. I thought it was just his way, the nostalgia of an 80-year-old man looking at the past. Little did I know that the word history was too small to describe what those walls held. The next day, a Saturday, I got up early. The air was still cool. I took my tools and went to the chapel to do a real assessment and start clearing the land. From the outside, it was beaten up. Inside, it looked even worse. The smell was a mixture of dust, damp wood, and abandonment. A beam of light entering through a broken tile illuminated the suspended dust. I started sweeping the floor, removing dry leaves, spider webs, and whatever else time had deposited there. The work was heavy, but I liked that seeing chaos become order. It was while I was cleaning the altar area, which was a simple structure of solid wood, that one of the floorboards moved under my foot. I found it strange. I crouched down and forced it a little. It was loose. With the tip of a spatula, I managed to lift it. And there, in a small hollow dug in the earth, was a bundle of waxed cloth. It looked quite old. Carefully, I picked it up and unwrapped it. Inside was a little book with a dried leather cover, but incredibly preserved. On the first page, in elegant and slightly shaky handwriting, was written, "Chronicles of Cashin, Servant of God." It was my great-great-grandfather's diary, the priest who, according to the family, had built that place with his own hands. I went back to Uncle Benjamin's house, sat on the porch, and started reading. And what a read! At first it was what I expected, a man of faith, full of hope, detailing the struggle to get donations and help for the work. But as the pages went on, the tone changed. Hope gave way to frustration. People promised and didn't deliver. Materials didn't arrive, money ran out. Then came the part that changed everything. He described a dream with a clarity that made me uncomfortable. A woman all in black visited him. She wasn't aggressive, on the contrary, she was cordial. But her questions were like razors. She questioned him about his faith, about the hypocrisy of religion. And finally, she made a promise. She said she would prove to him that the faith of those people was superficial, that they would worship anything presented to them with the right appearance. The next morning, according to the diary, the priest woke up to the sound of bells. When he went outside, he saw the chapel, which the evening before was just the basic structure, completely finished, doors in place, walls painted, everything done. He ran there, thinking it was a divine work, but upon entering, he felt something was wrong. There wasn't a single image of Christ or any saint. The crosses on the walls had strange proportions, almost imperceptible. For all the other residents, the chapel had always been that way. They treated him as if he were delirious. The last entry was short, and the handwriting almost illegible. He told of sitting alone on the church bench, trying to understand what had happened when he heard a whisper right in his ear. The same voice from the woman in the dream. "I told you." He turned around. There was no one there. I closed the diary and spent a good while staring at nothing. What a story. It was the tragic account of a man whom pressure and loneliness drove to madness. It could only be a psychological breakdown so strong that he created this fantasy to justify his own failure. That's what I thought. It was a sad but rational explanation. And at that moment, it was the only one that made sense. On Monday, I returned to work with the diary story in my head. It was like a song that won't leave your thoughts. I told myself it was just a family tragedy, but I couldn't help looking for the details my great-great-grandfather mentioned. I wanted to prove to myself that it was all his imagination. I started with the crosses carved on the walls. There were 3 large ones of dark wood. At first glance, they were normal rustic, but I'm an architect. Details are my work. I took the laser measuring tape and measured the first one. The vertical axis was perfect, the horizontal too, but the angle between them wasn't 90 degrees, it was 88. A minimal difference, impossible to notice with the naked eye, but deliberate. No craftsman with a minimum of pride would do this by accident. I went to the second cross, 91 degrees. The third, 89. They were all subtly crooked, correct enough to seem right, but fundamentally wrong. I felt a knot in my stomach. I continued working, trying to ignore it. I needed to check the roof structure. I climbed a ladder and called my uncle to help me hold it. "Uncle, don't you think the acoustics here are weird?" I asked, more to break the silence. He stood down there, looking at his own feet. "It's always been like that. Seems like we're talking inward." And that was exactly it. My voice didn't echo. It left my mouth and simply disappeared. It didn't have the reverberation that a place like that, with high ceilings and smooth walls, should have. I clapped my hands. The sound was dry, short, as if the walls absorbed it instantly. It was physics I couldn't understand. It was unnatural. That's when the other sensation began. I felt a chill, that feeling of not being alone. I would turn around and there was nothing but old benches and dust, but the feeling didn't pass. It seemed to come from the shadows in the corners, from the dark spaces in the ceiling. I felt watched not by a person, but by the construction itself. It was as if the chapel knew I was discovering its secrets and wasn't liking it one bit. I finished the day early. I gathered my things with a haste that wasn't like me. I wasn't scared, not like in a horror movie. I was deeply disturbed. My brain, which works based on logic, on angles and measurements, was short-circuiting. From outside, I looked back. The chapel was there, quiet, under the late afternoon sun. It looked harmless, an old, crooked little church. And for an instant I doubted everything I had measured and felt. Maybe I was the crazy one. That night I could barely sleep. Every noise in the old house, the crack of wood, The wind on the roof seemed amplified. I tossed and turned in bed, trying to find a comfortable position, but my mind wouldn't stop. The images from the diary and the crooked measurements of the chapel mixed together. I was exhausted, and I think it was this exhaustion that opened the door to what came next. I fell asleep and dreamed, but it wasn't a confused, fragmented dream. It was clear, real. I was back in my apartment in the city, sitting at my work desk in front of the computer. On the screen, the chapel projects were open. I could smell the familiar scent of my own space. I saw my books on the shelf, the view from the window. It was all mine, all safe. Then I felt a cold that didn't come from the window. It came from inside the room. I looked at the reflection on the dark monitor and saw it. There was a woman standing behind me. She was tall, dressed in a simple black dress of old-fashioned cut. A wide-brimmed hat covered her hair and face. The face was a blur of shadow, a darkness that moved like smoke, preventing me from seeing any features. It was exactly as my great-great-grandfather had described. "You are meticulous, Robert." Her voice was soft, polite, but resonated directly in my head, not in my ears. He was too, at first, the other one, the priest. I couldn't move. My entire body was heavy, as if submerged in water. "That place has potential," she continued, taking a slow step in my direction. I could see her approaching in the reflection. "You want to fix it, want to leave your mark, I can help." On the computer screen, the chapel blueprints began to redraw themselves. The lines straightened, the geometry became complex, beautiful, impossible. A masterpiece of architecture emerged before my eyes, a structure that would defy gravity and time. What do you want?" I managed to stammer in the dream, my voice dragging. The cordiality in her posture disappeared. The shadow on her face seemed to intensify. "I want you to stop ruining my work. You're trying to correct what's already perfect. That place doesn't obey your rules. It never has." I woke up with a gasp. My heart was beating frantically against my ribs. I was in my uncle's house bedroom, in the narrow bed, drenched in sweat. The darkness of the countryside was total, but the image of the woman and her voice were engraved in my mind with frightening clarity. It hadn't been just any dream, it had been a warning. The diary story wasn't about the past. It was happening again with me. I didn't close my eyes for the rest of the night. I sat on the bed, watching the darkness outside gradually lighten, turning gray and then blue. Fear gave way to a kind of determined calm. I could no longer trust my senses or my dreams. I needed a fact, a number, something that couldn't be explained by psychology, stress, or suggestion. As soon as dawn broke, I took my equipment case, left the hammer, and saw behind. I took only the high-precision laser measuring tape, a plumb line, a level, and a notepad. I wasn't going to restore anything anymore. I was going to measure that place. Returning to the chapel was different. The feeling of being watched was no longer a suspicion, it was a certainty. The silence inside seemed heavy, tense, as if the place was waiting for something. I ignored it. If this was real, I needed irrefutable proof. I started from the outside. With the laser measuring tape, I measured the external length of the chapel from the base of one wall to the other. 10.42 meters. I noted it, repeated the measurement 3 times. The number was the same. I did the same with the width, 6.20 meters. Exact numbers, concrete, the shell of the building. I took a deep breath and went inside. The air seemed denser, colder. I went to the back of the nave, pressed the device against the wall, and pointed the laser at the opposite wall, the entrance wall. I pressed the button. The red line crossed the empty hall. The number blinked on the small screen. My stomach churned. I read it again and again. It wasn't possible. 10.97 meters, almost half a meter more inside than outside. My first reflex was to blame the tool. The laser must be defective. Maybe the dust in the air was causing some distortion. I went back to Uncle Benjamin's house, almost running. I changed the device's batteries, cleaned the lens, and also took a manual metal measuring tape, one of those roll-up ones that never lie. I returned to the chapel. I felt my heart pounding. First the laser again, the same impossible measurement. Then the final proof. I attached the end of the metal tape to the door frame and walked backwards to the back wall, the metal unrolling with a metallic sound that sounded too loud in that silence. When the tape stretched, I looked at the marking. 10.97 meters. I dropped the measuring tape on the floor. The sound of metal hitting wood echoed briefly, muffled as always. There was the proof, the confirmation I had so sought. I wasn't crazy. The diary wasn't a delusion. That place was a physical impossibility, an error in reality, built with stone and wood. And for the first time I felt real fear. A clear fear, without panic, because now I knew, without a shadow of doubt, that the monster was real. I returned to my great-uncle's house with the notepad in my hand. The pages trembled a little. I wasn't thinking straight. I just knew I needed to talk to him, that I needed someone, anyone, to look at those numbers and understand. I found Benjamin on the porch, sitting in his rocking chair, cleaning some oranges with a pocket knife. The scene was so normal, so peaceful, that for a second the reality of what I had just experienced seemed like delirium, a passing fever. "Uncle, we need to talk. It's serious. It's about the chapel." My voice came out more urgent than I had planned. He stopped what he was doing and looked at me over his glasses, a tired look. I sat in the chair in front of him, leaned forward, and started pouring everything out. I talked about the diary, the crosses with wrong angles, the sound that died in the air, and then I showed him the notepad. "Look here, Uncle." I measured from outside, 10.42 meters, and from inside. I pointed to the other number. 10.97. It's impossible. A place can't be bigger inside than outside. There's no explanation for this. I showed him the paper. He looked, but didn't focus on the numbers. His eyes were on me. He put the knife and orange aside, wiped his hands on his pants, and sighed. A long sigh from someone who has lived a lot. "Robert, son, you're working too hard, getting too much sun," he said with a calm that irritated me deeply. These old houses are like that, everything out of square. The old folks made things by eye. "No, Uncle, it's not that. This isn't lack of square, it's lack of logic," I insisted, feeling desperation tight in my throat. "And the diary. Father Cashin saw all this. The priest was a good man, but loneliness messes with a person's head," Benjamin replied with a compassion that seemed like pity. "We know he didn't stay well at the end of his life. You can't take seriously the writings of a sick man." Each word of his was another brick in the wall rising between us. Each rational explanation was a blow to my sanity. I was living exactly what my great-great-grandfather had lived. The same condescension, the same refusal to see. The measuring tape, my voice failed. I used one laser and one metal. Both gave the same result. How do you explain that? That's when I saw it. For a fraction of a second, my uncle's calm expression disappeared. I saw fear in his eyes, an old, deep fear. My father also tried to measure. He murmured almost inaudibly, before shaking his head as if shooing away a ghost. The terror he felt quickly hid under a scowl. He stood up. The chair creaked. "Enough," he said, his voice suddenly hard, authoritative. "Enough of this subject. I don't want to hear about it anymore. Leave that chapel alone, boy. Some things are better left undisturbed." He turned his back on me and went into the house, slamming the screen door behind him. I was left alone on the porch with the useless notepad in my lap. The silence that followed was the final answer. He didn't think I was crazy. He was afraid. A fear so great that the only way out was to pretend nothing was happening. And it was at that moment that I understood the true horror. It wasn't the chapel or the woman in black. It was the silence. It was knowing the truth and being forced to swallow it alone. I was completely, terrifyingly isolated. The days following the conversation with my uncle were the worst. His silence was an accusation. I stopped working on the chapel. It no longer made sense, but I also couldn't leave. It was as if a part of me was trapped there, chained to that promise, and the sick need to understand how far this would go. And that's when things changed. The hostility of the place, which before was just a feeling, became something concrete. At night, I heard sounds coming from the direction of the chapel. They weren't the normal creaks of wood or the noise of wind. They were clear, defined sounds. Once in the middle of the night, I heard the distinct sound of a small bell, a single clear, pure note that cut through the silence. There was no bell in the chapel. On another night, I heard footsteps, a slow, rhythmic walk on the wooden floor. I knew it wasn't my uncle. He slept heavily. During the day, the persecution was more subtle. One day, I took courage and went there just to get my tools. I had left them organized in a corner. When I arrived, they were arranged in a perfect circle in the center of the hall. No one had entered there. I had the only key. Another morning, looking through the kitchen window, I saw something that hadn't been there the day before. A single flower of an impossible velvety black tone had sprouted from a crack in the entrance step of the chapel. It was a signature, a message. The persecution began to leak beyond the walls of the building. I saw shapes in my peripheral vision, even inside the house. The silhouette of the woman in black standing in the distance at the property line became a recurring sight. She would just stand there watching. I would blink and she would disappear, leaving me with the doubt of whether I had really seen her. Her voice came with the wind, a low whisper I could barely distinguish. "Alone," it said. They were needles in my mind. I began to notice a strangeness in the place itself. The vegetation around the chapel seemed sickly. The leaves of the trees had a grayish tone, the trunks were twisted. A few meters away, the rest of the property was green and alive. It was as if the chapel emitted a radiation of melancholy. Its influence poisoned the soil, and maybe not just the soil. I went to the small store in the center of the village to buy supplies. The people who used to greet me with smiles now looked at me with empty eyes. There was an apathy, a contained irritability in the air that gave me chills. The store owner, a man who always gave me a discount, handed me the change without saying a word, only to immediately start obsessively arranging some cans on the shelf, making sure the space between them was perfectly equal. He measured with his fingers, his eyes glazed. That evil had been there for generations, dormant, and I had awakened it. The climax happened 3 nights ago. I was in my room trying to read when a faint light from the window caught my attention. I looked, it was the chapel. There was a light inside, a soft, pulsing glow, like the beats of a slow, sick heart. I stood watching, mesmerized, and against all my will, my feet began to take me there. The door of my uncle's house creaked when I left. I walked through the damp grass, attracted by that light. The chapel door, which I myself had locked with a heavy padlock, was ajar. An invitation. When I was a few meters away, a sound came from inside. A sound that made every hair on my body stand up. It was a low melody, a hummed buzz, the unmistakable sound of a woman singing a lullaby. She was in there waiting for me. At that instant, the attraction broke, and an instinctive fear took over me. I turned and ran back to the house like I had never run in my life. I locked the door and cowered in my room, listening to my own racing heart trying to compete with the light that still pulsed in the darkness. I spent the night awake, huddled in bed, but fear slowly transformed into something else, a horrible clarity. I finally understood that thing's game. She didn't want to kill me. She wanted me to continue the work. She wanted me, with my technical knowledge, to legitimize the existence of that chapel, to make it beautiful and acceptable for a new generation, ensuring its permanence. The restoration wasn't a threat to her, it was the renewal of her contract. I understood that my great-great-grandfather didn't fail. He retreated. He understood that you can't fix what was born rotten. And now the choice was mine. Flee and leave the door open for the next one, or burn the door, the house, and everything inside. The next day, I acted like an automaton. I waited for Uncle Benjamin to leave for his shopping in the village. I went to the small shed in the back and found what I needed. 2 gallons of kerosene for the old generator, old rags, tow. I carried everything to the chapel, unhurried, feeling the construction's eyes on me. The air inside was different, no longer hostile, but presumptuous, triumphant. The melody of the lullaby seemed to have remained impregnated in the walls. I worked methodically, like an architect planning a controlled demolition. I soaked the wooden beams of the floor, the old benches, the base of the altar. I made a path of rags soaked in fuel from the back to the entrance. At no point did I feel hesitation. It was as if someone else was in control of my body. Someone who had already made the decision and was just executing the project. My family's legacy wasn't that construction, but the silent warning left in Father Cashin's diary. I wasn't destroying history, I was finishing writing it. When everything was ready, I stopped at the door. I looked one last time at the impossible space, at the crooked crosses, at the shadows that seemed denser in the corners. "It's over," I said to the silence, my voice sounding firm for the first time in weeks. I threw a lit match on the first rag at the entrance. The flame rose with silent force, running along the path I had prepared and diving into the darkness of the chapel. The fire didn't make the noise it should have. The sound was swallowed by the acoustics of the place, an almost silent fire. I didn't stay to watch. I turned my back and walked back to the house. I packed my bag, threw my things in the car. From my room I could see the orange, pulsing glow in the sky. Soon the sound of sirens and the first distant screams began to arrive with the wind. I left before sunrise, before having to look into my uncle's eyes. I drove down the dirt road, seeing in the rearview mirror the column of black smoke rising against the morning sky. I don't know if I did the right thing. I destroyed a heritage, a construction of more than 100 years. I betrayed my family's trust and probably caused immense pain to my great uncle, who, despite his fear, loved that place in his own way. But when I close my eyes, I don't see the flames. I see the black, impossible flower. I hear the lullaby and the voice that told me that place didn't obey my rules. Maybe it didn't obey anyone's rules in this world. I didn't win. You don't beat something like that. I just postponed the problem and became part of the dark history of that place. And sometimes, when the silence of the night is total, I look at the dark reflection of my computer screen, and for an instant, I seem to see the outline of a wide-brimmed hat. My name is Rodrigo, and what I'm going to tell you happened several years ago, when a global crisis hit us with such force that humanity was dragged into unprecedented chaos. At first it seemed like something temporary, but soon the situation overflowed. An unknown virus whose spread was unstoppable infected and killed within days. Governments, institutions, and companies failed. Streets emptied, hospitals collapsed, and people began fighting for the most basic things: food, water, and above all, survival. For me, the beginning of the crisis was an unexpected blow. I had heard about the pandemic on the news, of course, but like many, I saw it as something distant, something that wouldn't affect us. However, when supplies began to run short, when transportation stopped, and authorities imposed a curfew, I knew nothing would be the same. And it was then that temporary shelters were activated, places destined to offer protection to people in emergency situations. The shelter where I ended up wasn't luxurious, but it was better than the streets. It was an apartment building that the government had enabled in an area away from the city. Isolated, yes, but safe, at least for a while. The entry process was long and complicated. Health tests were required, documentation that validated you weren't a threat, and above all, a cooperative attitude. At that moment, all I wanted was to be safe, so without questioning much, I went through the procedures and was given access. The first impression of the place was one of disorganization. There were many people crammed in the hallways without much privacy, but the sensation of security made me feel calm. At first, the staff in charge of the shelter was composed of volunteers who mostly had no experience in emergency situations. They were ordinary citizens like me who offered to help. There were some doctors and paramedics, but few and with limited resources. The days began to pass slowly, with rationed food and increasingly terrifying news from outside. But soon I began to notice something strange. The shelter managers, initially very kind, began to show tension. The pressure of managing such a large group of people without sufficient resources seemed to be affecting them. In particular, there was a woman named Mariana in charge of logistics, who went from being cordial to a completely distant and visibly exhausted person. She was in charge of food and supply distribution, and at first she seemed to be handling everything with relative calm. However, as the crisis intensified, her behavior became more erratic. Food rations were beginning to run short, and fights to get something to eat were becoming more frequent. The first signs of tension among the refugees didn't take long to appear. People who were friendly before began to look at each other with distrust, accusing each other of taking more than their share. I remember one day, a man named Victor, one of the few who seemed to have some informal authority, approached Mariana to discuss the distribution of the last food boxes. His voice rose, and although the discussion seemed to be just one of those routine disputes, I could see something in Mariana's eyes. A contained fury, something she couldn't control. "This can't continue like this, Victor," Mariana said with a tense smile, but her hands were trembling. "There's not enough for everyone, and you know it. But we still keep pretending everything's fine." The tension didn't end there. As days passed and resources continued to be exhausted, people became more aggressive. I myself got involved in small fights over food, but the worst came one afternoon when a small child fell seriously ill. The few doctors remaining in the shelter were overwhelmed, and medical equipment was so limited they couldn't attend to everyone. The child was isolated in a corner of the improvised hospital, and Mariana ordered that he not be treated until it was confirmed whether he was infected or not. Fearful looks crossed among the other refugees. The environment was becoming increasingly heavy, more dangerous. The refugees began forming small groups, some defending Mariana and her team, and others beginning to question her authority, suggesting that the leadership was making wrong decisions. Discussions turned into confrontations. Some nights, you could hear screams and blows coming from the hallways. It wasn't uncommon to see the shelter security volunteers patrolling the areas with their batons, trying to control the fights. But you could already feel that control was out of their hands. One night after a long workday, I was awakened by a crash coming from the dining room. I ran there, and what I saw was something I never imagined. A group of people, including some of the most vulnerable in the shelter, had thrown themselves onto the food distribution table, grabbing packages and bags in a savage manner. People trying to defend the food were attacking each other, fighting to get what remained of the few available resources. Mariana, who until that moment had been trying to calm the situation, broke down. I saw her leave the room, her steps unsteady, her gaze fixed on the floor. The screams continued echoing in the dining room, and I, who was in the middle of the chaos, realized something terrifying. I had no control over what was happening. It wasn't just food that was being disputed. It was something much deeper. Fear, desperation, rage, all accumulated in the air like an invisible poison. But that was just the beginning. The next day, some refugees began to murmur about the possible outbreak inside the shelter. The sick child, whom we had talked about before, had died that night. No one knew if he was infected by the virus, but rumors began to spread. A couple of people began to suddenly fall ill, and quickly the rumor spread that the shelter was infected. In just days, fear took hold of everyone. Tensions grew exponentially. Distrust between groups deepened. On a rainy morning, a man from shelter security, Manuel, burst into my room. He was pale, sweaty, and his voice trembled. "Rodrigo, you have to come right now. Mariana has done something," he told me, almost whispering. I ran to the dining room, and what I saw chilled my blood. Mariana had locked several of the refugees in one of the back rooms, in what seemed like a desperate act of control. The reason, according to her, was that some of them had been too close to the sick child. No one could approach those few. No one could do anything. As hours passed, the situation worsened. The shelter became a kind of improvised prison. Doors were closed with padlocks. Rooms filled with whispers and muffled screams. Food rations no longer arrived, and what was once a place of refuge became a battlefield. No one knew who to trust. And then, one morning, the worst happened. The power failed. Ventilation systems stopped working, and the shelter, which before seemed like a place of shelter, became a hot and suffocating oven. People began to become more and more frantic. There was chaos in every corner. Fear was palpable, and screams echoed throughout the building. It was at that moment, in the middle of desperation, that all control completely vanished. I don't know exactly how, but at that moment everyone seemed to be looking for a culprit. It didn't matter if it was Mariana, the doctors, the volunteers, or even the refugees. In that shelter, we were all enemies, and although I tried to stay calm, I knew the real monster wasn't outside, it was among us. The shelter stopped being a shelter. It became a condemnation I still can't forget. The situation inside the shelter began to worsen with each passing hour. The lack of food, tension from fear of contagion, and the inability of those responsible to manage the chaos all accumulated in an explosive cocktail. No one knew who to trust, and suspicions overflowed everywhere. Every conversation was filtered by fear. Every look carried latent distrust. The hallways, which before were a common place where we transited normally, were now full of isolated groups. Every corner seemed to be occupied by small clans of people, protecting each other mutually, fearful that someone would try to steal what little remained of food or supplies. There was no longer any authority, only chaos. Mariana, the logistics manager, seemed to have completely lost control. She was adrift, surrounded by her own fear, unable to make firm decisions. As days passed, it became more evident that her nerves were betraying her. She was no longer the woman who at first seemed to have everything under control. Now she was overwhelmed, her face gaunt, her eyes opaque as if she were an empty shell. When I found her one morning alone in the improvised office they had set up for her, she didn't say a word, just stared through the window without really seeing anything. The lack of resources became more noticeable each time. The doctors, already exhausted and without medications, began making desperate decisions. People who fell ill no longer received adequate attention, and those who simply showed signs of exhaustion were left aside as if they no longer mattered. Nights were long, and when sleep finally came, it was plagued with murmurs and starts. People didn't sleep peacefully. Fear was a specter that stalked us from the shadows. The drop that spilled the glass occurred 3 days after the power failure. Throughout that day, the entire shelter was immersed in disturbing silence. No one spoke, no one approached. People just moved through the building, looking at others with distrust, as if we were all waiting for something terrible to happen. It was when it happened sometime during the night. One of the groups that had formed a small security nucleus within the shelter, composed of men and women who had armed themselves with improvised tools and sticks, began circling the hallways, trying to find a way to maintain order. The problem is they no longer knew what order was. There were rumors that some of the weakest in the shelter, those who looked sicker or more exhausted, were being considered a threat to the others, as if contagion were something more than a simple disease. Some people began to whisper that if one of the infected fell into the hands of others, we would all end up being infected. Fear of the unknown fed a paranoia that was out of control. At midnight, murmurs grew until they became screams. Someone had attacked a member of the security group, a man named Hector, who at some point had been considered one of the most sensible, but that night had exploded. Somehow, his paranoia had led him to think that the sick were an immediate threat, and he began hitting those who were already bedridden from fatigue or pain. "We can't afford to have more infected," he repeated. As violence unleashed, the hallways filled with screams and running. It didn't matter anymore who was sick or who was in charge. The only thing that mattered was surviving. The situation escalated quickly, and in less than an hour, most of the refugees were running through the building looking for the sick to isolate them. Everything became absolute chaos. I tried to stay on the sidelines, observing what was happening. I didn't want to be part of that madness, but at the same time, something inside me told me the situation had crossed a limit, that there was no going back. The refugees, already desperate, began making barricades with furniture and metal pieces. No one trusted anyone. The security personnel, who before had been a pillar of the shelter, became part of the problem. The screams of those trying to avoid being caught echoed throughout the place. That same night, things took an even darker turn. Some of the refugees began discussing the need to sacrifice some to save others. A couple of men, those who had grouped with Hector, began talking about purging the shelter as if it were a kind of cleansing. No one dared to question their words, because fear had penetrated so deep that everyone feared those who revealed themselves would be next. It was then that the shelter became something unrecognizable. People who before shared space peacefully began to separate, to isolate. Each group began defending their small territory with an aggressiveness I had never seen before. Discussions became fights, fights became attacks, no one was safe, and the worst thing is we no longer knew who the real enemies were. We had become our own monsters. One dawn, when the shelter seemed to be immersed in thick silence, something really terrifying happened. I saw two of the youngest volunteers, a couple of boys who, until that moment, seemed to be handling the situation calmly, quickly leaving through the building's back door. No one gave them importance at first, until an hour later, a group of refugees began running toward us, screaming in terror. "They killed us! They killed us!" they shouted with bulging eyes. What happened next was something I can't describe easily. The shelter, which was already a place of chaos, transformed into a trap. The back door had been opened by those two volunteers, and apparently they were bringing something with them. What we didn't know is they were transporting bodies. Bodies of those who could no longer be saved, those who had already fallen to contagion. They brought them not as victims, but as a kind of offering, as if the shelter was marked by a survival law in which only the strong should continue forward. The vision of those bodies, the way they dragged them through the hallways, as if they were objects more, made the others explode in uncontrollable panic. Those who had been looking for ways to survive now saw in every face a threat, and that was what destroyed us. The last barrier, the one that kept us united as a species, crumbled brutally. In the end, only one question tormented me: who had really won? Was there any winner in a situation like that? The people who arrived at the shelter with the hope of surviving fought for their lives. But what we found there was worse than the external crisis itself. Desperation, fear, paranoia, and violence destroyed everything we could once consider a community. Humanity, in the end, wasn't capable of saving itself. Good evening. My name is Victoria, and what I'm going to tell you began when my family decided to return to the place we should never have left. 15 years ago, we had to abandon our ranch almost overnight. It wasn't because of debt or family fights. It was because of something much worse. Something that spread throughout the entire mountain range. A violent silence that swallowed people. They said it was bad people, men who arrived and took control of the roads and pathways, and whoever didn't leave willingly simply disappeared. We lived those 15 years in a coastal town, a place that never seemed like ours. My father, Thomas, always strong, gradually withered with longing for his land. My mother, Sandra, clung even more to faith, praying every day for the time when we could return. My younger sister Lucy and I grew up with stories of the ranch, a lost paradise that only existed in their memories. When rumors that the situation had calmed down reached us, it was like a door opening. My parents didn't think twice. My older brothers already had their lives, their own corners. Lucy and I remained. I, at 20, felt a strange need to know that place, to understand the root of their longing. Lucy, younger, came with us to help. The way back already said everything. The asphalt ended and became a potholed dirt road that cut through brush that didn't seem friendly. It was dense, closed brush that seemed to want to swallow the trail we followed. The house was still standing, but it was a skeleton. The peeling paint, the windows without glass looked like dark holes, and the porch where my mother said she used to drink coffee threatened to collapse. My father got out of the car and stood still, hands on his hips, just looking. It wasn't the look of someone reuniting with an old friend. It was of someone evaluating a wound. "It'll take work," he said with a somewhat hoarse voice, "but we'll get this place back up." My mother didn't respond. She walked slowly to the front door, knelt down, and with the palm of her hand began to sweep the accumulated dirt from the threshold, a gesture that was half cleaning, half prayer. Lucy and I stayed behind near the car. The air there was heavy still. It didn't smell of nature, of life. It smelled of things stored away, of rotted time. That first night, lying on mattresses on the floor of the only room that didn't leak, I understood. We hadn't returned home, we had returned to what was left of it. And what was left, I can't explain, but it didn't seem happy to see us. In the first few days, the work was brutal. We pulled weeds, scrubbed slime from the walls, threw away what time had ruined. The silence was broken by the noise of our tools and my father's voice giving orders. Gradually, the house lost its abandoned look, but the strange feeling continued there in the air. To buy supplies, we went down to a little store that was a good few kilometers away, the only commerce in a huge radius. It was a small wooden place with a worn counter and shelves full of basic things. It was there that we began to hear the stories. Other few families, almost all older people, were also returning, and with them came the tales. They spoke low, like someone telling a shameful secret. A neighbor who heard a child crying in the middle of the night where no one lived. Another who swore he saw shapes passing by the roadside when he returned from town. My father just shook his head. He said it was talk from scared people, but my mother stayed quiet, just listening, her fingers squeezing the rosary she never took from her apron pocket. The first thing that really shook me didn't happen to me. It was with Lucy. One afternoon, she took the old bicycle we had brought and went for a ride. She wanted to see the creek my father talked about so much. She took longer than usual to return. When she arrived, she was pale, with wide eyes. She dropped the bicycle carelessly in the yard and went into the house, breathing short. "What happened, girl?" my mother asked, dropping the pot she was stirring. Lucy drank a glass of water in one gulp, her hand trembling a little. "Someone was following me," she said, and her voice barely came out. "I heard footsteps behind me in the brush. Every time I stopped to look, the noise stopped too. Must have been some animal, daughter an armadillo, a deer." My father tried to calm her. "It wasn't an animal, Dad." Lucy looked at me seeking support. "It was a whistle, very low, thin. It seemed like it was calling me. I pedaled as fast as I could on the way back. I didn't look back once." That night I took a long time to fall asleep. I stayed listening to the sounds of the house, the creak of wood, the wind outside. The whistle Lucy described wouldn't leave my head. It was no longer just a bad feeling in the air. Now fear had a sound, and it seemed to be getting closer and closer. A week later, the owner of the store, a gentleman with a mustache yellowed by cigarettes named Valdemar, called us to the corner of the counter. He had bought a ranch nearby, a bigger place with 3 brick houses. The name was Dry Lake Ranch. He said the place had a bad reputation, that it had been one of the main points of those bad people. And that's why the former owners never wanted to return. Valdemar, however, was a businessman. He wanted to clean the main house to move there with his wife and maybe rent the others later. "I heard the girls are hard workers," he said with one eye on me and another on Lucy. "The place has a bad reputation. People talk about hauntings, those usual nonsense things. But the only ghost I've seen there is the ghost of loss. That's why I pay well double what the gossips around here pay to scare away fear. It's just to give the big house a general cleaning and remove the worst of the dirt. I'll do the rest myself." The money was too good to refuse. We needed it. The next day, we took the bicycles and went there. Dry Lake Ranch was deeper in the mountains, on a detour from the main road. The iron gate was rusted, fallen to one side. From the moment we entered, the sensation was different. If at our house the air was heavy, there it was suffocating, a silence that hurt the ears. The main house was large, imposing, but looked sick. The exposed brick walls were stained with dark mold, and the brush had grown so much it embraced the walls, almost entering through the windows. As soon as we opened the door, a strong smell hit us. A mixture of humidity, dead animal, and something else, something sweet and rotten that turned the stomach. We started cleaning in the bedrooms. The floor was covered by a layer of dust, dry leaves, and insect carcasses. In one of the rooms, while I was sweeping a corner, I saw something that made me stop. There were dark stains on the wall near the floor. They looked like splashes. I tried not to think about it. Lucy was in the kitchen, and I went to the last room, the biggest one, at the back. It was darker than the others. While I gathered a pile of old rags with the broom, I felt a slow chill on my neck. I raised my head slowly. In the darkest corner of the room, near a doorless wardrobe, there was a man standing. He was tall, thin, and wore dark, torn clothes. His face was in shadow, but I could see he was looking at me. It wasn't a shape, it wasn't an impression. He was there. I ran out of air, the broom weighing a ton in my hand. I couldn't move, just look at him, waiting for him to do something. He didn't move, just stayed there staring at me from the darkness. With an effort that seemed to take an eternity, I opened my mouth. "Lucy." My voice came out weak, a wheeze. The instant her name left my mouth, the man simply disappeared in the darkness. Lucy appeared at the door, her face worried. "What happened? Did you scream?" I pointed to the corner, my hand shaking. There was a man there, right there. She looked, frowned, walked to the wardrobe. Looked inside, behind, there was nothing. "Victoria, there's nobody here. Must be fatigue, the smell of this house." I knew it wasn't. I knew what I had seen. That day we left early. And for the first time, I was afraid not just of the place, but of what the place seemed to want from me. We continued returning to the ranch for a few more days. Lucy always stayed nearby. We never separated inside there. I didn't tell my parents about the man I saw. My father would mock and my mother would fill with a fear that wouldn't help anything. We needed the money, but my fear didn't pass. It seemed like something gnawing at me from inside. I worked in silence, always glancing at the dark corners. A few days later, Valdemar asked us a favor. He had bought some tiles and wooden beams in town, and the delivery would be made at the ranch. He couldn't go receive it because he needed to take care of the store. He asked one of us to go just to sign the delivery paper. "They'll arrive around noon. Just wait for the truck and check the invoice," he explained. That day, my mother and Lucy needed to go to a health clinic in a neighboring district. An appointment my mother had scheduled long ago. I was left to go. The idea of going alone to that place gave me a knot in my stomach, but I couldn't refuse. It was a favor, and Valdemar was paying us well. I went by bicycle, my heart beating hard with each pedal. When I arrived at the fallen gate of Dry Lake Ranch, the suffocating sensation was immediate. I decided not to enter the house, not even think about it. I sat on a big rock near the entrance with the bicycle leaning beside me, from where I could see the little road. It was just waiting. Time passed slowly. The silence was absolute. Even the animals seemed to avoid that place. That's when I heard a noise, a dry crack of stone hitting stone coming from the brush to my right. I became tense, my eyes fixed on the direction of the sound. I thought it was some animal. Then another stone fell, this time closer. Someone was there. I jumped up. I stood rigid, alert to anything. My first reaction was to grab the bicycle, be ready to run. When I bent down to hold the handlebars, I felt a violent push on my back. I was thrown forward with a force that took my breath away. I fell face first in the dirt, the taste of dust and dry leaves filling my mouth. Before I could understand what was happening, something grabbed my ankle. The hand was cold, hard like a dry branch, and squeezed with absurd force. It started pulling me, a jerk, then another, dragging me across the ground of dirt and stones toward the closed brush. Panic took over me. I thrashed, tried to kick with the other leg, but it was useless. The branches scratched my face, my arms. With each pull, I went deeper, away from the little road, away from the light. I managed to turn my head and saw it. It was a dark figure hunched over me, with clothes in tatters and long, dirty hair that fell over the face. His breathing was a horrible sound, a rapid, guttural wheeze, like that of a hungry animal. In the midst of desperation, I began to scream, even knowing there was no one to hear. With my free hand, I felt the ground and found a stone. I threw it back without aim in his direction. I hit something because the pulling stopped for a second, and he turned to me. I'll never forget that face. The skin seemed rotten, pulled over the bones. The eyes were two white cavities, lifeless, and the mouth. The mouth was open in a kind of smile, showing teeth that were too white, too clean to be in that rotten face. Desperation gave me a strength I didn't know where it came from. I contorted, kicked with all my fury and felt the hand holding me loosen for an instant. It was enough. I pulled my leg violently and dragged myself away from him, getting up clumsily. I didn't look back. I ran. I ran with all the strength I had, stumbling on roots, my lungs burning until I saw the light of the road again. I grabbed the fallen bicycle and pedaled aimlessly, just wanting to leave that hell behind. I pedaled without feeling my legs, just the burning in my lungs and the taste of blood in my mouth, where I must have bitten my tongue. My arms and back burned from the scratches. Tears ran down, mixing with sweat and dust. At each curve in the road, I looked back, expecting to see that dark figure coming out of the brush, following me. I passed another abandoned house with the roof almost on the ground. For an instant, I looked toward the open door and froze immediately. There was a dark silhouette standing there in the opening, tall and motionless, like a cutout in the shadow. I didn't stop. I lowered my head over the handlebars and pedaled with even more force, fear doubling my back. It was as if the entire mountain range was sick, and I had just touched the rottingest part of it. I don't know how I got home. I dropped the bicycle on the ground and went in, locking the door behind me, a useless gesture. My parents and Lucy hadn't returned yet. The silence of our own house, which before was comforting, now seemed full of holes, places where anything could enter. I ran to the bathroom, looked at myself in the small mirror, and barely recognized myself. The dirty face, the bulging eyes of terror, an ugly scratch on the cheek. I washed the wounds, the water stinging, and changed clothes, hiding the worst scrapes. I wasn't going to tell. Nobody would believe. That night, sleep wasn't a refuge. It was a continuation. I dreamed I was being dragged again, feeling the dirt scraping my skin, the rotten smell of that thing, the sound of its breathing. I woke up several times, my body soaked in cold sweat, my heart hammering. The worst came a few nights later. I woke up with Lucy shaking me, her face pale under the weak light of a lantern. "Victoria, wake up," she whispered, her voice full of panic. "What happened?" I asked, my head heavy from bad sleep. "You were talking." Her eyes were fixed on me. "It wasn't a dream. You were having a conversation." I didn't understand. I sat on the bed, my whole body shivering. "Talking to whom, Lucy? We're alone in the room." "I don't know." Her voice rose a little. "You spoke low, some words I didn't understand, and there was another voice responding. It seemed like someone was under your bed." I felt a knot in my stomach. "What other voice?" "A whisper," she said, almost crying. "It came from close to you, very low. It seemed like someone was under your bed. I heard it, Victoria. I swear I heard it. And you were laughing. A low, horrible little laugh." I shook my head, but a deep terror began to take over me. I didn't remember anything, absolutely nothing. The next morning, when I went to make the bed, I felt something rough under the sheet. I pulled the cover. Scattered near where my feet stayed, there was a handful of dark dirt and dry, brittle leaves, the same dirt from dry Lake Ranch. It was no longer just a memory or a nightmare. Whatever that thing was, it hadn't let me go when I fled. Somehow, I had brought it inside the house, inside my room. From that night on, everything changed. I became a stranger within my own family. Lucy didn't sleep well anymore. She left the lantern on all night, and sometimes I woke up and she was sitting on the bed, just watching me in silence, with eyes full of a fear that broke my heart. After a few days, she made up some excuse and took her mattress to our parents' room. I was left alone with my fear, and with whatever slept with me. My mother, Sandra, perceived the gravity of the situation in her own way. She started a silent protection ritual. She began placing a line of coarse salt at my door before sleeping. She forced me to drink bitter-tasting herbal teas that, according to her, cleaned the body from within. Every night she sat beside me and prayed softly, passing a rue branch over my head, over my body, while asking God to drive away all evil. I let her because I saw the desperation in her eyes, but nothing helped. The feeling of always having someone beside me, a cold and heavy presence, didn't go away. My father, Thomas, was the most difficult. He didn't see with the same eyes. For him, everything was fatigue, nervousness from the move. He saw my pale face, my dark circles, my lack of appetite, and diagnosed it as nonsense. This girl needs work to occupy her head. I heard him tell my mother one night, his voice muffled coming from the kitchen. The tension exploded during a dinner. My mother had made soup, and I was just stirring with the spoon, my stomach churning just thinking about swallowing. "Aren't you going to eat again, Victoria?" my father asked, his tone already loaded with impatience. I shook my head without being able to speak. "Thomas, leave the girl alone." My mother intervened, her voice gentle. "She's not well." "Not well, why?" he retorted, banging the spoon on the plate. "Because she lies down all day with that scared face. That's not sickness, Sandra. It's something in her head." "This isn't something in her head." My mother's voice rose firm, a rarity. "Don't you see? Evil got hold of her there in that cursed ranch. This isn't something for a doctor." "Oh, don't come at me with those stories," he shouted, getting up. "Evil possession, haunting. We came back here to work, to have peace, not to live in an asylum." He left, slamming the door, and I stayed there sitting between my mother's silent crying and my father's empty place. The smell of soup made me nauseous. I was the reason for the fight. I was the disease in the house. The fear I felt of that invisible entity began to mix with something else, the terror of being destroying my family from within. I was completely alone, trapped between my father's skepticism and my mother's frightened faith. The explosion happened 2 nights later. I had gone to bed feeling the usual chill, the sensation that the air around me was dense and cold. I fell asleep and fell into the same dark pit as always. What happened next? Once again it was Lucy who told me, but this time my parents also saw. A loud noise woke them at dawn, a sound of something heavy being dragged in the living room. My father jumped up, thinking it was a thief. My mother and Lucy came right behind with a lantern. When they reached the living room, they found me. I was standing in the middle of the room, barefoot, wearing only the thin nightgown. My arms were stretched to the sides, and my head tilted back at an angle that seemed painful, unnatural. My eyes were open, but empty. "Victoria," my father called, his voice uncertain, stopping a few steps away. I didn't respond. Slowly my head straightened. The movement was rigid, like that of a wooden doll. And then I smiled. It wasn't my smile, it was the same ragged smile, of teeth too white that I had seen on that rotten face at the ranch. Lucy let out a muffled scream. My mother began to pray softly, the words stumbling over each other. "What did you do to my daughter?" my father asked, anger in his voice now mixed with evident terror. The thing inside me laughed, a dry sound that came from my throat. "She's not yours anymore," the voice said. It wasn't mine. It was a dragging whisper, double, like 2 people talking at the same time. "She liked the dirt. Now she's going to stay in the dirt with us." That was the end for my father. His stubbornness ended there. He advanced to hold me, to shake me, to bring me back. But before he could touch me, he was thrown backwards, as if he had been punched in the chest by an invisible hand. He fell sitting, his face white with shock, unable to breathe properly. That's when my mother acted. The fear in her eyes transformed into protective fury. She placed herself in front of my father and Lucy, raising the small wooden rosary she carried in her pocket as if it were a weapon. "In the name of God, I order you," she shouted, her voice echoing in the silent house. "Leave my daughter alone. You have no place in this house. You have no power over this soul." With each word of hers, my body contorted. The thing screamed through me, a mixture of rage and pain. A gust of cold wind swept the room, extinguishing 2 of the 3 lanterns and making the pictures on the wall sway. "Go back to the hole you came from," my mother screamed, tears running down her face. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." At that moment, my body was arched back violently. I opened my mouth, and a scream came out, a thin scream that didn't seem human, that didn't seem to fit in my lungs. A sound of pure evil being torn out by force. And then everything went black. I collapsed on the floor like a rag doll dropped. I woke up in my bed. The first thing I felt was an immense silence, not in the house, but inside me. The constant cold had gone away. The feeling of being watched, the weight on my shoulders, everything had disappeared. I was exhausted. My whole body hurt as if I had been beaten for hours. But I was alone inside myself for the first time in weeks. My family was around, their faces tired but relieved. Nobody talked about what happened. There was no need, we all knew. Life began to return to being almost normal. My father never again touched the subject with anger or disbelief. Sometimes I caught him looking at me with an expression of guilt and an affection he hadn't shown since we were children. Lucy returned to sleeping in our room. The house became lighter. Last week, while sweeping the room, I found something near the foot of my bed, hidden under the rug. A single dry leaf, dark and brittle, exactly like those that covered the floor of Dry Lake Ranch. I threw it away, but the memory stayed like the scar of an ugly burn. About a month later, my father returned from Valdemar's store with a face I had never seen. He sat at the kitchen table and stayed silent for a while, looking at his own hands. "They isolated Dry Lake Ranch," he said finally. His voice was low, grave. "The police are there. Nobody enters, nobody leaves." "But why?" my mother asked, stopping washing the dishes. My father took a deep breath. Valdemar started digging to make a new well. He found things buried. "Bodies," he said, and the word weighed in the kitchen air. "A bunch of them, a pit full of people. They say there are more. The whole dirt around there is full of people buried from that time." At that instant, everything made a horrible sense. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a common haunting. It was something much worse. It was the weight of dozens of lives interrupted with violence, of all the desperation and agony that dirt absorbed. The thing that attacked me, that entered me, was the sum of all that. A heavy, hungry shadow born from human evil. Today I understand that what happened to me wasn't an attack, it was an infection. I stepped on an open wound of the earth, and the pus from that wound leaked into me. My mother, with the strength of her faith, managed to clean me, to sew me back together. But the scar is here. The shadow was expelled from my body, but it continues there in the mountains, in the dark dirt of Dry Lake Ranch. And a part of me knows that No matter where I go, a piece of that shadow will always walk with me. My name is Andrew, and I never imagined that this account, a survival story that should have been ordinary and common, would become something so disturbing. I'm not one to tell strange stories or talk about conspiracies or weird theories, but what happened in that emergency shelter left me with a mark, a doubt that still persists. Today, after everything I saw, I'm no longer so sure of anything. I'm a common man, one more in the big city. I live in a small apartment, a bit old, but enough to consider it home. I work in a coffee shop, nothing exciting, and I usually come home exhausted after long workdays. My life has never been anything out of the ordinary. But that night changed everything. We live in uncertain times. The city is no longer what it was. Violence has been increasing. The streets have become more dangerous, and the feeling of being constantly alert is palpable. People have become more distrustful, and news about riots, protests, and emergency situations don't stop appearing on our phone screens. The night when everything happened, I was on my shift at the coffee shop, serving the few customers who remained. It was already late. The clock showed close to 11 at night when the sirens began to sound. At first, I thought it was a false alarm, as it happened so many times before. But then the news transmission on my phone began to update. Emergency shelters enabled throughout the city, alert for massive riots. Something in my gut told me I should pay attention. The city had never experienced anything so serious. It wasn't just a revolt or a strike. Something much worse was happening, and soon the messages began to be more alarming. There wasn't much to do. The customers who remained, mainly people like me, city dwellers who already knew how to move under pressure, got up and left quickly. The place began to empty, and as the street darkened more, I decided that the best thing would be to follow the government's recommendations. An emergency shelter had been established not far from where I lived. I had to go there before the streets became impassable. I ran to my apartment with my mind still confused by what was happening. When I arrived, I took the essentials: some clothes, a backpack with basic provisions, and my phone already charged to the maximum. I didn't know what to expect, but something inside me told me I should be prepared for the worst. The shelter was in an industrial area of the city, an area that was normally uninhabited. The building was a huge structure of concrete and steel, with a metal security door that apparently had become the only available access. A couple of soldiers were stationed at the entrance, watching people approaching, making sure there were no conflicts. It wasn't the type of place where you would normally find peace, but at that moment, it seemed to be the only safe place. Upon arrival, a uniformed woman with a kind of protective vest asked me to register and assigned me a bunk inside one of the large rooms. It wasn't anything luxurious, of course, but at least it felt safe. The room was full of other people, some older, others like me, younger, waiting, without really knowing what was happening outside. We were all quiet, exchanging puzzled looks. As the night progressed, the situation outside became more tense. Through the shelter windows, you could hear screams and distant noises, as if the city was completely collapsing. Around 3 a.m, a man, an elderly man with a gray beard and tired eyes, approached me. There was something in his expression that intrigued me. He sat on the bunk next to mine and began talking as if we had known each other all our lives, as if the emergency situation was the perfect excuse to share deep thoughts. "Do you know what's happening out there, son?" he asked me with a raspy voice. I didn't know if the question was an invitation to talk or an accusation. "What they say on the news is that there are riots, but something tells me it's not just that," I replied without knowing very well what to say. My mind still couldn't assimilate what was happening in the city. The old man looked at me fixedly, almost as if he could see beyond what was on my face. "Haven't you ever felt that all this makes no sense, that we're always running without knowing why? We think we're here for a reason, but what if all this is nothing more than a cycle? A cycle we can't escape from." His voice was low, almost a whisper. And although his words seemed taken from a conspiracy theory book, something in his tone made me think he knew something more than all of us, something they didn't want to say. "What do you mean?" I asked him, a bit annoyed by the enigmatic tone of his speech. The man leaned toward me and whispered, "This shelter isn't just to protect us from the riots, Andrew. This place is just a facade. Here all of us are part of something bigger, something that not even those in charge understand. The reason we're here under surveillance doesn't have to do only with what's happening outside. It has to do with what they're making us believe. We're not here to survive. We're here to be part of something bigger, and we'll never leave." I remained silent, not knowing how to respond. I was tired. My mind couldn't process all that information. But the old man kept talking, almost without anyone else noticing. "This shelter, this emergency place has existed for longer than you think. The government doesn't protect us. It controls us, keeps us here to continue observing our reactions. All this is part of an experiment, a simulation, if you want to call it that. They're watching us like rats in a cage, and every time we think we're safe, they move the pieces on the board. They want to convince us that we're here to survive, but it's not like that. We're here to be part of something bigger, and we'll never leave." I felt uncomfortable. What was he saying? It was as if he was talking about a conspiracy I didn't understand, and yet something in his words resonated with me. Maybe it was the desperation in his voice or the certainty with which he spoke, but something inside me began to stir. I looked around and saw the faces of the other refugees. No one seemed to be listening to the old man, but everyone seemed trapped in their own thoughts, as if something weighed on their chests. During the following days, I began to notice strange things. The shelter, although supposedly destined for our protection, seemed to be full of hidden cameras, of people who moved without making noise, observing us. Sometimes I saw the guards talking among themselves in low voices, with a tension I had never perceived before. No one explained to us what was happening outside, and supplies were beginning to run short. Every time someone asked what was occurring, the answers were vague. Everything under control, just stay calm. But what disturbed me most was the place itself. Some rooms seemed to have more doors than they should. Hidden doors that weren't seen at first. At night, I heard strange noises coming from those rooms, as if someone was walking, or as if they were doing something they didn't want us to see. Each time it was harder for me to sleep. One night, when I couldn't take the anxiety anymore, I decided to investigate. Secretly, I began walking through the dark hallways of the shelter, trying to discover what was really happening. I ventured down one of those hallways I had always overlooked, a dark corridor that seemed to lead nowhere. At the end of the corridor, I found a door that was slightly open. A small glow of light filtered from inside. Trembling, I pushed the door, and what I saw left me frozen. There was a room full of screens, like a control center. But what surprised me most wasn't the technology or the number of monitors. It was what I saw on the screens. Each one showed the refugees us. But not only that, they showed our reactions, our movements, our conversations. They were watching us. We were being monitored in such a precise, calculated way that it made me doubt everything. The old man was right. We weren't here for our safety. We were here because we were part of an experiment, a study for something we couldn't even understand. And now, with the evidence in front of me, I began to wonder what was really happening in the outside world, what they were doing with us, and most importantly, how they knew so much about us. I was no longer sure of anything. The only thing I knew with certainty is that this shelter, this supposed emergency place, wasn't what we thought, and maybe it never was. At first, I tried to convince myself that what I had seen couldn't be real. Maybe the tension was playing a bad trick on me. Maybe I hadn't paid enough attention, and my mind had created an erroneous interpretation of what was happening in that control room. But the next day, when the guards made us to the facilities, I felt my anxiety skyrocket even more. The hallways seemed emptier than usual. The hidden cameras seemed to be everywhere, and a constant surveillance sensation had taken over the entire shelter. The old man wasn't wrong. There was something deeply strange about all this. During the following days, I became more observant. I couldn't help it. It felt like I was trapped in a kind of observation cage. Something as subtle as a look I crossed with another refugee could be analyzed and recorded by the people controlling the shelter. Although I didn't see anyone else observing us, I felt there was a superior power that was taking note of each of our movements, our gestures, our words. No one else seemed to doubt the situation, and everyone accepted the restrictions as part of the game. No one questioned what was happening outside, what was occurring in the world, the noises from outside, the rumors. Everything seemed to vanish in the thick air of uncertainty. That sensation of being trapped grew stronger when I began to notice that the guard visits, especially the security officers in charge, became more frequent. Every time someone left the common room to go to the bathroom, or simply walk through the hallways, one of them followed them closely, observing them in silence. It wasn't open harassment, but the pressure was there, like an invisible shadow. The old man, who had already disappeared from the bunk where I had seen him for the last time, always told me, "Never look for answers, Andrew. You're not going to find them. It's what they want, for you to doubt yourself until you don't know what's real and what's not." The first time I saw one of the monitors in action was when I tried to ask about the old man. No one seemed to know about him. No one had heard of him, not even the guards. That sensation that they were hiding something from me increased more and more. Finally, I decided to go again to the hallway where I had seen the screens, the control room, and this time I wasn't going to let anything stop me. I had to know the truth. That night, when the lights went out and the shelter fell into the silence that only darkness can provide, I walked stealthily through the hallways toward the place where I had seen the screens. The air was heavy, as if there was something invisible pressing on my shoulders. I passed several closed doors, each one with a sign on top indicating they were restricted rooms. I stopped in front of the control room door, the same one I had seen ajar that night. To To my surprise, the door was completely closed this time, without cracks through which I could sneak. I wasn't going to give up so easily. I observed both sides of the hallway, making sure no one was near, and decided to try to open the door. Fortunately, the lock wasn't sealed. I pushed it slowly, and the door opened with a slight creak. At first, everything was silent, and my breathing echoed in the darkness. But then I saw what had scared me so much. The screens were on. There were more than a dozen monitors, each one showing real-time images. The worst wasn't that. The worst was what I saw on the screens. On some monitors, people's faces weren't just in a static position, as if they were simply sitting or standing. No. On some monitors, their faces were distorted, as if their bodies were subjected to a type of manipulation, a control I couldn't understand. I saw how a woman's eyes dilated unnaturally, how a man shook erratically, as if he was being controlled by something external. It was as if the shelter was analyzing more than our movements. It was analyzing our psyche, our responses to stress situations. It was as if we were being observed as guinea pigs beyond our understanding. I tried to back away, but something made me stay there a moment longer. On one of the larger monitors, I could see someone I recognized. It was me. I was sitting on one of the bunks as if everything was normal, but something didn't fit. I was looking at the monitor with a fixed expression, as if I was looking outside without moving at all. And on that same monitor, I saw something I couldn't believe. In the lower corner, there was a camera focused directly on my face, but it wasn't a common camera. It was more like a kind of device that emitted an intermittent light over my eyes, as if it was manipulating my perception. It was then that I understood we weren't in a shelter. This wasn't an emergency facility. It was a place where they controlled us, where they manipulated our minds, our emotions, everything. People weren't here just to take refuge, but to be studied, to be controlled. And the worst, what disturbed me most, was the notion that we didn't know anything about what was happening outside. We could be in a bubble, in a space isolated from the world, and we wouldn't have any idea if there really was a crisis outside, or if everything was just a distraction, a pretext to keep us here under their surveillance. Suddenly I heard footsteps approaching quickly. I froze, trembling with fear. I ran toward the door and closed it carefully. My mind couldn't process what I had just discovered, but what I did know was that I could no longer stay there another minute. I couldn't continue being part of this experiment, this game. The next day I decided to leave. No matter how or what was needed, I had to find an exit. But when I approached the shelter entrance, I stopped dead. There were soldiers everywhere. I wasn't sure if they were waiting for me, or if I simply coincided in seeing them at that moment. But something told me they already knew what I had discovered. A feeling of desperation invaded me, and at that precise moment I realized I had no exit. I was trapped. Maybe I had never had an exit. Maybe everything I had lived up to now had been part of their plan. Maybe there was no way to escape this cycle that had begun long ago. I stopped in front of the main door, looking at the soldiers, wondering if I would ever find the complete truth. Was it a shelter or a prison disguised as security? The answer at that moment seemed clear, and yet in my heart, a small voice told me I still didn't know the most terrifying thing of all. Maybe I never would. My name is Charlie. For about 5 years, I've worked at a factory that assembles automotive parts. It's not the kind of place you tell interesting stories about. Life inside there is measured by the sound of the siren and the repetitive rhythm of the production line. It's a constant, metallic noise that sticks in your head and follows you home. Over time, you learn to filter it out, to create a kind of particular silence in the middle of the chaos, or at least you try. In the middle of all that racket, there was a different sound, a whistle, a short, simple melody that always came from the same direction. It was the sound of old Dave. He was past 50 and worked at the machine next to mine. He had a calm way about him, almost as if he didn't belong to that frantic environment. While everyone else always had a sour face, running to meet quotas, he seemed to operate at his own rhythm. I was new to the company when they put me on his line. In the first few weeks, I was struggling a lot to get the fit of a specific part right, and one of the supervisors was always on my case because of it. I was almost ready to quit. One day during shift change, old Dave approached, waited for the supervisor to move away, and showed me a trick, a small wrist tilt that made the piece slide effortlessly. He didn't say much, just patted my shoulder and said, "You'll get the hang of it, kid. The rest is just patience." That changed everything for me. It might seem like little, but in that environment, a gesture of help like that was worth gold. From that day on, his whistling stopped being just another noise in the factory. For me, it became a kind of reminder that even in the most impersonal place in the world, there were still people. It was a sound that brought calm, proof that routine hadn't swallowed everyone. It all started on a Monday. I arrived for my shift, and for the first time in years, the machine next to mine was quiet. Old Dave's spot was empty. I found it strange, of course, but didn't give it much importance. I thought he might be sick or maybe had taken the day off to resolve something. It happens, but the whole day passed, and the silence in that corner of the production line became heavy, uncomfortable. On Tuesday, the same thing, his post empty. That's when the factory grapevine started working. During coffee break, everyone was already commenting. Nobody had news. The supervisor, when asked, only said that he hadn't shown up and hadn't called to give any explanation, which was totally out of character for him. Old Dave was the type of employee who, if he was going to be 5 minutes late, made a point of calling ahead. Concern began to replace the strangeness. On Wednesday, the news hit everyone hard. One of the managers gathered the team and officially communicated it. Dave's family had filed a missing person report. He had left home Sunday night on his way to work to catch the night shift and simply never arrived. No one had seen him since. The police were called, but the factory workers themselves mobilized. The last place he could have been seen was on a shortcut that many people used. The factory is in a somewhat isolated area, and to get to the main bus stop, you either took a huge detour of almost 15 minutes via the avenue or cut through a giant vacant lot, a wasteland full of tall grass and brush. During the day it was fine, but at night the place was pitch black. We only knew that old Dave took that shortcut when he was in a hurry. At the end of the shift, a group of about 20 employees, myself included, went there. With the weak flashlights from our cell phones, we spread out through the brush, looking for anything, a document, the cell phone, a sign of a struggle, any trace. We found absolutely nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air on that 200-meter stretch between the street and the factory gates. The weeks went by, the police reduced their searches, and life, as always happens, forced everyone to move forward. Another employee, a temp, was placed at Dave's machine. The factory went back to being what it always was, a noisy place focused on numbers and production. But for me, the silence continued there. The absence of that whistle had left a hole in the noise of my day. Everyone's sadness became something only mine, something I kept to myself. It was about a month after the disappearance that the rumors started. You know how factory gossip is, stories run the factory floor faster than any official news. It started low with the night shift folks. I heard fragments of conversations in the cafeteria, in the locker room. They were saying that the electronic time clock system, the one we use our fingerprint to register entry, was having some kind of problem. At first, I completely ignored it. Factory equipment is always breaking down. It wouldn't be the first or last time. I thought it was just that, a technical failure, and that people's imagination, already shaken by Dave's story, was filling in the gaps with things that didn't exist. I even found it a bit morbid, to be honest, creating ghost stories on top of a real tragedy. But the story didn't die. On the contrary, it gained strength. It stopped being a malfunction and started having a scheduled time. The talk was that every night, around 10 o'clock, the exact time that old Dave arrived for his shift, the time clock would beep by itself, as if someone had just registered entry, even with no one around. I continued treating it as nonsense, a factory legend, but deep down it began to bother me. A doubt kept hammering in my head. That story just wouldn't leave my mind. The time clock story simply wouldn't go away. Every time I thought the subject had died, someone from the night shift would comment again, always with a somewhat scared, somewhat fascinated air. It got to a point where I needed to know the truth, not for gossip, but out of respect for Dave's memory. It seemed wrong to let his name become a hallway haunting. I needed to hear from someone who wasn't just passing along a rumor. I needed to talk to Adele. Adele was the night shift supervisor, a serious, competent woman who had no time for games. I waited for the right day during shift change, when the night people are arriving and the morning folks are leaving. I saw her near the control room with a clipboard in hand and a more tired expression than usual. I took a deep breath and approached. "Adele, excuse me, can I have a minute with you?" She looked at me first, without recognizing, then focused on my face. "Oh, hi, Charlie, you can talk, but it has to be quick because we're about to start running the line." Her voice was practical as always. I didn't know quite how to start, so I went straight, but carefully. "Listen, people have been talking about some things, some stories about the time clock. I wanted to know if it's true." Her face closed immediately. She looked away, as if searching for a way out of the conversation. "Charlie, that's factory worker nonsense. You know how people are. The system had some failures. We already called the IT people. Subject resolved." But her manner said otherwise. She was adjusting the papers on the clipboard unnecessarily, her voice a little harder than normal. "I understand," I insisted, lowering my voice a bit. "It's just that I was close to old Dave. This whole story, I don't know, seems wrong to me. I just wanted to know what's really happening." She was silent for a moment, staring at me. I saw her shoulders drop a little, as if she had given up. She looked around, pulled me by the arm to a more secluded corner near the water fountains. "It's not nonsense, Charlie." Her voice was now a low, quick whisper. It happens every night, always around 10 o'clock. She told me. She told me that the first time she herself heard the beep and went to see who had arrived, she didn't see anyone. Finding it strange, she accessed the system record. The last name on the screen was his, with the entry time marked. She thought it was an error, a bizarre bug, but the error repeated the next night and the next. Other employees heard it. One of them went with her to the computer and saw the record with his own eyes. My stomach turned, but I still tried to find logic. But it could be an error in his fingerprint registration, something like that, right? Adele shook her head slowly. Her gaze was fixed on an empty point in the hallway. I thought that too. We thought of everything. But there's one more thing. She paused, and the way she looked at me gave me the certainty that there was more. It's not just the clock beep. After the device beeps, a few seconds later, we hear the whistle. My throat closed. The whistle. His whistle, Charlie, she confirmed. And for the first time, I saw real fear in that woman's eyes. The same melody as always, soft, as if he were coming down the hallway. It's just for an instant, and then it stops. But everyone who was nearby has heard it. There's no system error that explains that. I left Adele's vicinity, not knowing exactly what to think. The factory noise seemed distant, muffled. The only thing echoing in my head was the word whistle. The story had stopped being a hallway rumor to become something palpable, real, confirmed by a source who had no reason to invent that. The fear I felt before was vague, a morbid curiosity. Now it had a name, a face, and what was worse, a sound. In the days that followed, I could no longer work in peace. Every piece I fitted in the machine, using the trick that old Dave had taught me, seemed like a reminder. The silence at the post next to me was no longer emptiness. It was a feeling that there was something there where there was nothing. I caught myself looking toward the hallway, imagining the scene, the clock beeping for nothing, followed by that phantom sound. Part of me, the sensible part, screamed for me to forget it, leave the night shift to those who belonged there, and get on with my life. But the other part, the one that remembered the pat on the shoulder and help at the right moment, wouldn't let me. I felt I needed to understand. Maybe it was a debt of gratitude. Maybe it was just curiosity I couldn't control. The truth is, it didn't matter what the reason was. The idea of going there, of seeing with my own eyes and hearing with my own ears, became an obsession. It took me 2 days to arrange the swap. I talked to a colleague from the night shift, a guy who was dying to get a few days with free mornings to resolve things at the bank. I made up some excuse about helping my sister with a move. It was simple bureaucracy, a supervisor's signature, an adjustment to the spreadsheet. Everything normal, routine. Nobody imagined the real reason behind that request. The following Monday, when the sun began to set, I prepared to go to the factory. The feeling was strange, a weight in my stomach. I wasn't going to work. I was going to wait for that thing to happen. I was going to meet something that all my reason told me to avoid. And while I locked the door of my house, in the quiet of early evening, I could only think of one thing. What the hell was I doing? Entering the factory at night was like entering another world. The place that during the day was an anthill of people and chaos of noise became a huge, quiet place. The large production lines were shut down, and the dominant sound was a low, constant hum from ventilation systems, and one or another essential machine that ran non-stop. The service lights, dimmer, created points of yellowish light. leaving large areas in shadow and stretching the shadows in a weird way. We were few, maybe a fifth of the day staff, and the feeling was of occupying a space that didn't belong to us. I tried to concentrate on my task, but it was useless. My eyes wouldn't leave the digital clock on the wall about 20 meters from where I was. Every minute dragged. 9:40, 9:50. I felt my heart beating at a different rhythm from the factory's hum. I was tense, waiting for something I didn't even know if I wanted to happen. I looked around. The other few employees were at their posts, concentrated. Nobody seemed to notice my anxiety. The smell of cold metal and oil seemed stronger in the still air. 9:59. I stopped what I was doing. I held my breath. The machine hum seemed to recede, as if the whole world was holding its breath with me. The seconds seemed not to pass. And then came the sound. A sharp, clear electronic beep cut through the monotony of the environment. The exact sound the clock made when validating a fingerprint. It lasted a second and was followed by a deep, almost artificial silence. For an instant, part of me relaxed. That was it. A phantom beep, a weird malfunction. But the part that remembered Adele's voice knew it wasn't over yet. And it wasn't. About 5 seconds after the beep, it began. It came from the hallway that led to the locker rooms where the clock was located. It was low, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A short melody whistled, old Dave's melody. It didn't sound like an electronic sound, didn't have the static of a recording. It was a sound that seemed human, not from a recording. It lasted about 3 or 4 seconds and disappeared. I remained completely motionless with the tool in my hand. Air wouldn't enter my lungs. I looked to the side toward a colleague who worked about 10 meters away. He was also stopped. Our eyes met through the factory's twilight, and we didn't need to say a single word. He had heard it, he knew, and his look confirmed to me what I now had absolute certainty of. The story was real. I continued on the night shift for the rest of that week, and the ritual repeated. Every night without exception. At 10 o'clock, the beep. Seconds later, the whistle. The initial shock gave way to a fear that became routine. Me and the other employees, we didn't comment on the subject, but there was a silent agreement in the air. In that minute, everyone became a little quieter, a little tenser. It was our secret, the ghost that we all pretended not to see, but that haunted us every night. On my last night of the swap, Friday, something was different. When the whistle began, it didn't seem to come from the hallway. The sound sounded more distant, as if it came from far away. It was a subtle perception, but it changed everything. An irrational impulse took over me. I needed to see. I dropped what I was doing and walked, almost without thinking about what I was doing, toward the large wire-reinforced glass windows that faced the back of the factory. My heart was beating very hard. Each step seemed heavy. Those windows faced the vacant lot, the shortcut. The factory's floodlights illuminated a stretch of gravel courtyard and the beginning of the brush. But after that, it was complete darkness. The darkness there was so dense it seemed like a solid wall. The shortcut was just a faint line, a mark of beaten earth that disappeared into that wall of darkness. And that's when I heard it. Standing exactly where the reflector light died and the darkness of the terrain began, there was a silhouette. The shape of a tall, thin person cut out against the darkness. It was simply standing there, motionless, facing the factory. You couldn't see face, clothes, nothing. It was just the shape of a person where there shouldn't be anyone. He made no threatening gesture. He was just there, watching. At that instant, everything connected in my head. The whistle that seemed to come from outside. The figure standing at the entrance to the exact path where old Dave disappeared. The time clock. Maybe the machine was never about the machine. The device was just an echo, an antenna that picked up the presence that was out there all the time. The real haunting was there, trapped in that place. I stumbled backwards, moving away from the window with a dry mouth. I looked around desperately, but there was no one else in that stretch of the warehouse. Nobody else had seen. That somehow had been just for me. I returned to my morning shift the following week. The sunlight, the deafening noise of the production line at full steam, everything seemed like a relief in the first few days. I tried to convince myself that the darkness and silence of the night had played a trick on my head. But the image of that silhouette standing at the edge of the brush wouldn't leave my mind. I no longer looked at the back windows. I forced myself to get into the routine, to focus on work, to be just another cog. About 3 weeks later, management announced they would modernize the access systems. They hired a third-party company that came and changed everything. They took away the old-time clock and installed a new, more modern device with facial recognition. The night shift people commented that the problem had ended. There was no more beep or whistle. It seemed like technology had solved the problem. Old Dave's ghost had been, finally, deleted from the system. The months passed. The story became legend, one of those that older employees tell to scare newbies. Life continued, but I didn't forget. For me, the silence that remained in place of the phenomenon was as scary as the sound itself. It was a silence that proved something really had been there. Until yesterday, I had to stay late to close a production batch that was behind schedule. When I left, the factory courtyard was almost empty and the sky completely dark. I was walking toward the gate, the sound of my steps on the gravel seeming too loud in the quiet. I was passing alongside the fence that separates the factory from the vacant lot. That's when I heard it. It didn't come from inside the factory. There was no beep before it. It came directly from the darkness of the brush about 20 meters from me. Low, melancholic, unmistakable, the whistle. Old Dave's short, simple melody floating in the night air. I stopped walking. The streetlights in the distance seemed to flicker and disappear. I stood there in the middle of the courtyard, listening. He was no longer trapped to the clock. He was no longer trapped to the 10 o'clock schedule. He was free, or maybe he always was. I keep thinking sometimes that I shouldn't have looked, shouldn't have switched shifts, shouldn't have gone to that window. From looking so much for a ghost, maybe I made him notice that I was there listening. The company changed the machine, but the truth is there was never a fix. Old Dave never left that place. And now I hold for myself that, no matter where I go, a part of me stayed there with him, waiting forever for the next whistle. My name is Hugo, and I want you to understand that everything I'm about to tell you is real. What happened that night changed something in me, and although several months have passed, I still can't get the feeling that something or someone is watching me out of my head. I was always a nature lover, one of those who enjoy the tranquility of the forest, the long, unhurried walks, listening to the crunch of leaves under my feet. That's why I decided to undertake that trip. I had no fixed destination. I just wanted to disconnect. get away from the noise, and find some peace in the middle of the wilderness. I was in the area of the Cascade Mountains in Washington State, near the Olympic Peninsula, a place known for its dense vegetation, the song of exotic birds, and endless hiking trails. I had been walking all day, enjoying the landscape when it began to get dark. I decided the best thing was to find a place to spend the night. There was a refuge I knew by sight, not far from where I was, and although I had never spent much time there, its location seemed ideal to me. Secluded, quiet, a safe place. The refuge was simple, a wooden cabin built years ago by the government for hikers. It had a zinc roof and a few windows that didn't allow you to see inside from outside. When I arrived, I felt relieved. I was exhausted, and fatigue weighed on my shoulders. So without thinking much about it, I went inside. The refuge was in good condition, though somewhat dusty. It seemed like it wasn't used frequently, but that didn't worry me. I quickly settled in, spread my sleeping bag on the floor, and began preparing some food. Night was advancing rapidly, and the darkness of the forest surrounded me. I was so tired that I fell asleep almost immediately, but something wasn't right. It was a subtle noise that woke me up. Not a loud creak or something that really caught my attention, but a light tapping, almost imperceptible. Something that repeated once, twice, 3 times, as if something or someone was knocking on the refuge door carefully. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried not to give it too much importance. It had probably been some animal, a curious creature, or even a branch hitting from the wind. Still, the sound left me uneasy. I got up from my sleeping bag and approached the door, with my heart beating a little faster than normal. I looked through the crack in the window, but I saw nothing in the darkness. I breathed deeply. I told myself everything was fine and went back to lie down, convinced that my mind was playing a trick on me. However, the feeling that I wasn't alone didn't leave me in peace. Every time I closed my eyes, the tapping returned, although now it seemed to come from different points around the refuge. I didn't dare get up again. Maybe the wind was playing with the old cabin woods, or some animal was walking nearby, but something deep in my mind told me it was more than that. The night advanced slowly, and with it my thoughts. I felt the need to make sure everything was okay. I got out of my sleeping bag and walked to the small window, trying to peek my head out. Nothing. The forest was in total silence, and the darkness was so dense you could barely see anything. A couple of stars shyly appeared, but there wasn't the slightest sign of life. It was then that I heard what made me shudder, a weak whisper, but clear, coming from outside. I wasn't sure what it said, but it sounded like an almost human murmur. I blinked several times, trying to understand if it was my mind playing tricks or if I was really hearing something. The wind wasn't blowing. The silence was total, broken only by that strange whisper. I was paralyzed, not knowing what to do. My mind began playing with the most terrifying possibilities. Was it an animal, a lost person? The idea of being alone in that place, in the middle of nowhere, caused me a slight dizziness. I decided not to stay there much longer. I took my flashlight and turned it on, illuminating the interior of the refuge. The light gave me some tranquility, but I knew I couldn't stay there waiting for something to happen. I left the refuge with the flashlight in hand and walked toward the forest entrance, looking in all directions. I saw nothing, but the air had become denser. I felt pressure on my chest, as if the forest was breathing hard, waiting for something. I looked around, and at that moment, I noticed something strange. There were footprints, fresh footprints that hadn't been there before. They weren't animal tracks or from any being that had stepped on the place before me. They were human footprints, small, as if someone with bare feet had walked around there. My stomach tightened, and cold sweat began to cover my skin. I was sure there was no one else in the surroundings. There were no signs of any other presence. But those footprints told me I wasn't alone. I decided to return to the refuge, but before entering, something caught my attention. In the distance, beyond the trees, I saw a figure. It was hard to distinguish, but I could notice it was moving strangely, as if it was walking slowly toward the refuge. Fear paralyzed me, but I couldn't stay there doing nothing. I decided to enter quickly, close the door, and wait. My mind was full of unanswered questions. Who was that person? What did they want? Inside the refuge, the tension was unbearable. The tapping on the door started again, louder now, as if something was trying to enter. Fear made me turn around myself, looking for an exit, but there was no way. I couldn't run, I couldn't flee. The footprints, the figure in the forest, something told me everything was connected. The whisper, the tapping, the footprints, the strange presence. All these elements formed a pattern, but I couldn't understand what it meant. Then suddenly, a sound broke the silence of the night. It was a loud, dry blow that came from the back part of the refuge. Something or someone had hit the wooden wall. My heart began to beat harder, and I felt the urgency to get out of there. I headed toward the back window, trembling, and when I peeked out, I saw it. A man, or what seemed like a man, was standing in the darkness. He had no face, just an imprecise shadow, but his posture was strange, as if he wasn't completely human. I don't know how long I spent looking at that figure, but when I finally reacted, I realized I couldn't stay any longer. I took my things and ran without looking back. The refuge was left behind, and although I looked one last time over my shoulder, I saw nothing more. The forest seemed quiet, peaceful again, but in my mind, the same question resonated. What was it that I really saw that night? I have never returned to that place. The fear of what might be there continues to haunt me. And although I try to convince myself it was just a hallucination, something inside me knows that what happened that night was real. Several weeks have passed since that night, but what I experienced in that refuge continues to haunt me. I have tried to talk to some of my friends about what happened, but when I mention the topic, words get stuck in my throat. I don't know how to explain to them what I felt, what I saw, what I heard. The only thing I can say is that the fear I experienced has no logic. It was something more visceral, something I couldn't rationalize, and that eats away at me. Every time I close my eyes, I can still hear those soft tappings on the door, the whispers coming from the forest, the faceless figure that appeared in the darkness. What torments me most is that I haven't been able to find any logical explanation for what happened. I have reviewed the refuge area several times, even with some friends who agreed to accompany me, but we found no footprints, no traces, no signs that someone had been there. Everything seemed to be in its place. However, something inside me, a small part that continues fighting to stay rational, tells me that what I experienced was a warning. Maybe it wasn't the first time someone ventured into that forest and experienced something similar. The uneasiness that remained in me after that incident forced me to investigate more about the area. I searched in local books, talked to older people in the nearby town, and the only thing I could make clear is that the Cascade Forest has a very ancient history. There are rumors about disappeared towns, places where people got lost and never returned. Some say the forest is cursed, that nature itself keeps dark secrets, but nothing concrete. Every time I tried to go deeper into the history, the answers were vague or denied. But still, I couldn't help thinking that what I experienced in that refuge was related to something bigger, something that goes back generations. What happened that night in the refuge wasn't just an encounter with the unknown. It was as if the place itself was conscious of my presence, as if the forest was watching me, as if by being there I had broken some invisible barrier, and now something was looking for me. I returned to town a few days after the experience, determined to leave the fear behind, but my head wouldn't stop thinking about the matter. I talked to Don Felix, an elderly man who had lived his entire life in those surroundings. He wasn't someone superstitious, but his deep knowledge of the area places was always mentioned. I felt that if anyone could give me more light, it was him. "Son, that refuge is no place for anyone," he told me with a voice that was graver than I expected and with a penetrating look, as if what I was telling him wasn't something new to him. At first, his response puzzled me. Why was he telling me that? What did he know about the refuge? I decided to keep asking, despite the fact that Don Felix's words seemed to go beyond what I imagined. "The refuge," he continued, "is in an area where many have disappeared. And it's not that there's something special about the refuge itself, but the forests here have a history, son. There's talk of an ancient settlement many years ago that was right where the refuge is, a town that disappeared without a trace, without explanation. Some say what happened there wasn't natural. The place was forgotten, but something remained. Something didn't finish leaving." My skin crawled when Don Felix mentioned the town's disappearance. The missing piece began to fit in my head. Maybe what I had experienced in the refuge wasn't just a coincidence. Perhaps what I had felt, the footprints, the figure, the whispers, were echoes of something that had happened in that place years ago. Something that still remained there waiting to be discovered or disturbed. The old man looked at me seriously, as if trying to transmit a non-verbal warning. "Don't go again, son. Sometimes it's best not to ask too much about certain things. If you look for what happened there, you might find yourself with what you never wanted to know." His words hit me deep, but the feeling that I should return to the refuge didn't disappear. I felt as if I was tied to that place, as if I couldn't rest until I understood what had really happened. However, Don Felix's words resonated in my head, and I knew that if I returned, I ran the risk of facing something that could change my life forever. For weeks, I tried to continue with my life. I returned to work, to my daily routine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Sometimes, when I walked down the street, or when I was alone in my apartment, I felt as if I was being watched, as if someone was watching me from the shadows. The whispers I had heard that night in the refuge began to invade my dreams, each time more intense, more real. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to return. I went back to the forest a month after the experience. There was no concrete reason for my return, only a visceral need to know what happened in that refuge, to give myself an answer that I knew I probably wouldn't find. The walk to the refuge was as silent as the last time, but now my heart was beating with an anxiety I hadn't felt before. As I approached, the air became denser, and the environment seemed to change, as if the forest had become aware of my presence. When I reached the refuge, everything seemed the same. There were no new footprints on the ground or signs that someone had been there since the last time. Everything seemed silent, but something inside me told me I wasn't alone. I entered the refuge cautiously, and when the light from my flashlight illuminated the interior, I found something that made me stop dead. There was something on the floor, something that wasn't there before. Footprints. Human footprints, but not like the ones before. They were more recent, as if someone had entered during the night. But the strangest thing of all was that the footprints didn't disappear on the floor. They didn't lead anywhere. They stopped right in the center of the room, as if the person who had left them had suddenly disappeared, as if they had never been there. My breathing accelerated. I knew something wasn't right. And it was at that moment when the flashlight light moved toward the corner of the refuge that I saw it. It was a figure, a shadow standing against the wall, motionless. I couldn't see it clearly, but something in its presence made me feel I shouldn't approach. Before I could react, the refuge door closed with a loud slam, as if an invisible hand had shut it hard. A chill ran down my spine, and the whisper, the same one I had heard that night, filled the air again. This time it wasn't a distant murmur, it was closer, deeper, and my name was repeated in each whisper. I ran out of there like never before. I ran without looking back, without thinking of anything but escaping from that place. The forest seemed denser, more oppressive than ever, and the feeling of being watched pursued me with every step. I never approached the refuge again, and now, every time I pass near those forests, I feel something watching me from the darkness. Maybe I shouldn't have gone there in the first place, but it's done. What happened that night has no explanation. I don't know if I was the only one who experienced something like that, but I know that something is still there, waiting, and I don't know if I'll ever know what it really was. All this happened when I was 14 years old. I lived with my mother and my two sisters on a ranch, in one of those rural areas where the asphalt ends and houses are separated by long distances of brush and dirt roads. To go to school in a nearby community, we depended on a single bus line that passed once in the morning to take us and another at the end of the afternoon to bring us back. There wasn't much choice. It was a small place, so the arrival of new people always became a topic of conversation. That's how we found out that a lady with 2 children had moved into a house that had been empty for years, right on the border of one of the properties. Shortly after, her daughter, Erica, who was 15, 1 year older than me, entered my class at school. You could tell from a distance that she wasn't used to that rhythm. Her hair was always neat, she spoke little, and seemed to look at everything with some distrust, as if expecting an animal to jump out of every bush. In the first few weeks, she didn't approach anyone. We only really talked because of a group activity. And from then on, she began to join our group during breaks. One Saturday, Erica invited me to her house to review some notes for a test. My mother authorized it, but with that usual condition, to return before it started getting dark. I walked there on a path that went around a small hill. Upon arriving, the feeling was of an even more isolated place. The house was simple, with a wire gate and a zinc roof already showing rust spots. Erica received me and said her mother had gone with neighbors to get firewood. She said she was going to prepare some lemonade, and that I could go in and leave my things in her room. While I was arranging my notebooks on the bed, I heard a little voice coming from the next room. I approached the door that was just pushed to. I peeked inside and saw her little brother, a boy who must have been about 6 years old, sitting on the floor. He was facing an empty corner of the room, talking in a low voice, as if conversing with someone. There were no toys, no television, just an old armchair against the wall. He spoke, paused, nodded, and smiled as if he were answering questions I couldn't hear. The scene was so strange that I stood there watching. The moment he noticed my presence, he stopped talking. He just turned his head in my direction, looked at me for a second, and then lowered his eyes without saying a single word. I was left without reaction, so I just moved away and returned to Erica's room, pretending I hadn't seen anything. When Erica returned with the juice, I didn't touch the subject. We studied for about 2 hours, but the image of her brother Neville talking to nothing wouldn't leave my head. The calm way he did it was strange. It didn't seem like a child playing. It was different, more serious. At recess, a few days later, I couldn't stand it and told Erica what I had seen. She sighed a tired sigh. "He's been doing that since we moved here." She looked around as if to make sure no one was listening. At first, my mother thought it was because of the move, missing the city, friends from there. But then he started saying some weird things. "What kind of things?" I asked, trying not to seem too curious. "He says his friend's name is Jake, and that Jake doesn't like him to play with other children, that he gets jealous." My mother gave him some scoldings, forbade him from talking about that name. Since then, Neville doesn't touch the subject around her anymore, but he continues doing some strange things. "Like what?" Sometimes he separates a little food on his plate, as if it were for someone. The other day I caught him making the bed and leaving an empty space beside him, all neat. I asked him not to do that anymore, but I don't know if it helps. I asked Erica not to tell her mother that I knew, but to keep an eye on her brother. She agreed. The conversation ended there, but that wouldn't leave my head. It wasn't just an imaginary friend. There was something wrong in the way she described the situation, a weight I couldn't explain. I had the impression that Erica already knew deep down that it wasn't just child's play. A few days later, Erica invited me again, this time to sleep over. It was a weekend, early November, and we wanted to watch a special horror story program that was going to be on television. Her mother would be away at a wake in a neighboring district, so the house would be just ours. I took a backpack with a change of clothes and arrived a little before 8 at night. We had some bean soup that her mother had left ready, and then went to the room. Neville was already lying down, but when the second story of the program started, he got up and entered his sister's room, saying he was afraid to stay alone. Erica let him lie on her bed, with the condition that he wouldn't keep looking at the television. He covered himself with the blanket up to his head and stayed quiet. After a while, I began to notice that the boy was moving a lot. He changed position, grumbled softly, pulled the blanket as if someone were trying to take it from him. Suddenly, he sat up in bed all at once. He was pale, with wide eyes, staring at a corner of the room where there was a box with some old clothes. "Jake won't let me sleep," he said with a trembling voice. "He keeps talking in my ear. He doesn't want to play anymore." We were left without reaction. Erica tried to calm her brother, but the boy wouldn't stop shaking. "He's angry," Neville continued, almost crying. "He's pulling me, I don't want to go with him." At that moment, I got up and turned on the ceiling light. And that's when I saw it. Something moved in the corner. It was a quick shadow. A dark form that seemed to shrink as soon as the light came on and disappeared. What came next was even worse. A horrible smell began to come out of that side of the room. It was a smell of rotten meat, of dead animal left in the sun for days. We covered our noses, but the smell was so strong it seemed to enter our clothes, our hair. We opened the door, the window, tried to make the air circulate, but it didn't help. The smell was there, dense, coming from that corner. Neville curled up in bed and didn't want to open his eyes anymore. Erica tried to call her mother, but the call wouldn't go through. The signal there was terrible. I sat on the floor near the door and got a chill, an ice that wasn't from the weather. The ceiling light blinked a few times. We spent the rest of the night awake with the light on, without courage to say a word. We just stayed there waiting for day to break. The next morning was silent. Nobody talked about what had happened. There was no need, we all knew. The next morning was silent. Nobody talked about what had happened. Erica's mother returned around 7, and although she noticed we hadn't slept at all, she didn't ask many questions. We had coffee with bread, and I left early. I walked the whole way back home, glancing through the bushes, with a horrible fear that something would jump out of the brush. This feeling of having someone watching me didn't pass for several days. Erica didn't come to class on Monday. She missed the whole week. I was worried, but had no way to get in touch. When she finally returned, she told me that her mother had taken Neville to a known spiritual healer in the region. The boy had started talking to himself again, but this time in front of her. He said Jake woke him up at dawn and said it was time, that he was going to take him for a walk under the bed. According to Erica, the spiritual healer said something had attached itself to the boy, an old thing that had been living in that house long before they arrived. They did a cleansing with eggs, prayed over him, and burned rue branches throughout all the rooms. For a few days, it seemed like things had calmed down. Neville didn't wake up screaming anymore, and had finally slept a few consecutive nights. But when I returned to her house already at the end of the month, I noticed something was still wrong. The air inside seemed heavy still. There was a smell of stored things, of mold. It was a silence that bothered. That afternoon, Erica showed me some old notebooks she found while organizing a closet. They were school notebooks from another child. Some parts were written in pencil, with childish handwriting, and accompanied by drawings of small figures, like stick figures, always standing in the corners of the drawings. They were drawings of beds, windows, doors. On several pages, a name was repeated, written over and over, as if the person had been forced to practice the signature. Anthony. I don't know whose they are, she told me quietly. My mother only knows the house belonged to a distant relative who died many years ago. That gave me chills. Jake was a common nickname, but Anthony was too much information to be just a coincidence. After discovering the notebooks, things that before were just strange began to become scary. Not a week passed without Erica telling me something new. One night, while we were doing a school assignment over the phone, she told me she heard footsteps in the house's attic. They weren't animal footsteps, they were heavy, like a person walking from one side to the other. Another day, she told me she found the bathroom door unlocked when she was sure she had locked it from inside. Neville, for his part, said Jake was no longer his friend. He said now he gave orders, that he got violent if he didn't obey. I told Erica she needed to tell her mother everything, but she confessed she had already tried. Her mother didn't want to believe. She said they were children's things, that we were watching too many movies. But the worst was what she told me later. One night, passing by her brother's room, she heard him say he didn't want to go, that his head hurt when his friend touched him. When she entered, the boy was alone, crying with a nosebleed. That's when I had the idea, a terrible idea, I know. I told everything to my cousin Aline. She was older, always been a bit different. She read about these things, believed in everything, and said she talked to spirits using a board she had made herself. I explained what was happening and asked her to go with us to the house. We agreed on a Saturday afternoon. She brought the board, some white candles, and a small bag with coarse salt. We locked ourselves in Erica's room. Neville was with his mother on the other side of the house. Aline explained the rules to us. Keep calm, don't ask silly questions, don't irritate whatever was there. She placed the board on a small table, lit the candles, and spread the salt in a circle around us. We put our fingers on the pointer without applying force. At first nothing happened. You could only hear the wind outside. After several questions without answer, the pointer moved very slowly, forming the word Jake. Erica took her hand away immediately. Aline asked her to breathe deeply and come back. She asked the board who it was. The pointer began to move faster with more force. Friend, it wrote, Anthony. The answers were short. It said it lived there, that it was alone, and that Neville was its new friend, that the boy belonged to it. The pointer moved with an energy that didn't come from us. When Aline asked what it wanted, it wrote, Take. Suddenly, the pointer began to spin out of control, sliding over the letters, without forming any word. The candle to the right of the table went out suddenly, as if someone had blown it out. A freezing wind passed through us. Enough, Aline said with a firm voice. She moved the pointer by force to the word goodbye, put away the board, and threw the salt outside the house. We stayed silent. We had done exactly what we shouldn't have. We had provoked it, and now something knew that we knew of its existence. That night I could barely sleep. It was no longer just for Erica or her brother. It was for me, for Aline. We had called for something without knowing what it was, and now it seemed like that thing had answered. Erica told me later that since that session, Neville had become even more withdrawn. He no longer talked much, ate little, and spent hours staring out the window, as if waiting for someone to arrive. The proof that we had spread the problem came from Aline. She called me a few days later, her voice tense on the other end of the line. Cousin, things have been happening here at home since Saturday. What kind of things? I asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't be good. Noises, closet door that opens by itself. Last night I swear I heard footsteps in the hallway at dawn, and I was alone at home. Whatever that thing is, it didn't stay just there at the ranch. I froze. If it was already bad for her, who only went there once, imagined for me, and then it started at my house. One morning I woke up, and when I got out of bed, I stepped on something kind of wet on the floor. I looked down. There were small stains of dark, wet dirt on my floor, right beside the bed. They weren't quite footprints. They were more like smudges, as if something small and dirty had stopped there. The first thing I did was look for a logical explanation. I thought about the dog, but he always slept in the living room. I checked my shoes. They were in the laundry area. The bedroom window was locked, and strangest of all, it hadn't rained. Where could that wet dirt have come from? I cleaned the floor, trying to convince myself there must be a simple explanation I wasn't seeing. But the next morning, it happened again. There were the stains in the same place, small traces of dark dirt. This time, I couldn't calm myself down. I searched the entire room, looking for any crack, any hole. There was nothing. It was impossible. At that instant, the security I felt in my own room ended immediately. Fear was no longer confined to Erica's house. Somehow, I had brought a piece of it to mine, and it knew where I slept. While I dealt with my own silent panic at Erica's house, things went completely wrong. Her mother, who until then found any excuse not to believe, finally came face to face with what haunted the family. She told me that one night, while cleaning Neville's room, she felt a cold, wet breath on her neck, as if someone were breathing in her ear. She turned quickly, but there was no one. The room was empty. Right after, the mirror that hung beside the dresser simply fell from the wall and broke into 1,000 pieces on the floor. There was no wind, nobody touched it. At that moment, it clicked for her. Desperate, she wanted to talk to someone from the church, but didn't know any priest who did house blessings. I said I could ask my uncle, who knew a clergyman in the county, an elderly gentleman who sometimes visited smaller communities. We contacted him, and to our surprise, he agreed to go. 2 days later, the priest arrived. He walked through the entire house, room by room, praying softly with a prayer book in his hand. Neville didn't want to leave bed. He stayed covered the whole time, saying Jake was very angry. While the priest prayed, the environment became increasingly dense, heavier. At the end, he told us the house needed more than a simple blessing. "There's something trapped here," he said with a serious look. "A bad force that's not human." Before leaving, he said something that left us even more uneasy. It wasn't the first time he had heard of a presence with that name. In another locality, years ago, another family spoke of a certain Anthony, a child's friend who became violent if they didn't obey him. They also had to abandon everything. That same night, Erica's mother decided to sleep in the room with Neville. But around 3 in the morning, we woke up with screams. We ran to the room and found the lady fallen on the floor. She said she felt something pushing her from the bed with a force that didn't seem normal. Neville was sitting with open eyes, but without any expression. When we tried to help her get up, the room door slammed with a violence that made the wall shake. The doorknob turned, and the latch made a dry click. We were locked in. We panicked. We threw ourselves against the door, but it wouldn't move. And then Neville spoke, but it wasn't his voice. It was a hoarse, thick voice that came out of that small child. "He's mine," the voice filled the room. "Get out of here." His mother, crying, began to pray loudly. Erica and I continued forcing the door with kicks, pushes. I don't know how long it lasted, but at some point, with a crack of breaking wood, the latch gave way. We didn't think twice. We grabbed Neville, who continued limp like a doll, and ran out of that house into the darkness of the night. The decision was made there in the middle of the yard, breathless and scared to death. They would leave forever. The next day, I helped Erica and her mother put what they could into a borrowed pickup truck. They weren't moving, they were fleeing. They left furniture, clothes, a bunch of things behind. Erica cried silently. Neville seemed calmer, but it was an empty, apathetic silence. When they left, the house stayed there, closed. Nobody ever lived in it again. Over time, the brush took over. In the first few days, a strange silence took over the place. a weird relief that didn't really calm you. I lost touch with Erica for a while. We moved from the ranch a few years later. She would send me a message now and then. She said in the new city things were calmer, that Neville slept better and didn't talk about Jake anymore. I came to think that maybe the distance had broken that connection, until I received the last message a few good months later. It was Erica. She said that morning her brother had locked himself in the bathroom and started talking to himself again. He said Jake was angry that he had followed them and that he would never, ever leave them alone. After that, she never wrote to me again. Today, more than 10 years have passed. I try not to think about it much. I try to convince myself it was a collective breakdown, a suggestion, anything. But I know it wasn't. I know because of the guilt I carry for having taken my cousin with that board, for having poked at something that should have stayed quiet. And I know mainly for another reason. I live in an apartment now, on the 3rd floor of a building in another city. There's no dirt near my window. I don't have plants in the room. But still, there are mornings when I wake up and know, before even looking, that they're there. The small stains of dark, wet dirt on the bright floor beside my bed. They don't appear always. Sometimes months pass, but they always return. They're a reminder that Neville never got free from his friend, and that somehow I never got free from that either. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.